I think that we're very worried here looking at that fire because when the earthquake first hit, no one really knew. We didn't really think about as far as to cut off their gas, and as soon as we realized to tell them to cut off their gas, perhaps in this particular situation, too late.
Well, I think you've put your finger on precisely the point, because it's been suggested to me that what causes fires like that in the event of an earthquake is precisely a ruptured gas main. Now, it may well be that even if people had turned off the gas in their homes, when a main ruptures, and if you have any kind of sparks caused by the friction of the earthquake itself, there is nothing that could prevent that fire from beginning. But what reports do you have, Sidney, if you could just bring us up to date? I've been saying now for the past half hour or so that we do not yet have any kinds of casualty reports. We don't know if anyone's been killed. We don't know if anyone's been injured.
Right.
Can you bring me up to speed on that?
And Ted, what we're finding out at this particular point, I just talked to CHP about 10 minutes ago. And
California Highway Patrol?
Right, the California Highway Patrol. The problem they are having is the problem that I think all the emergency, Office of Emergency Services, all the people in San Francisco are having. The phone lines are down. The California Highway Patrol is trying to get to all of their offices to try to get reports on what is happening in the particular districts. And they're having a very, very difficult time. I managed to get through, and at this particular time, they're trying to just get their forces together and try to survey the particular districts and the particular areas within the Bay and the East Bay. What they could tell me is that they are mobilizing forces. They are bringing in their helicopter and some other pieces of equipment from Sacramento, from the capital. They are also mobilizing forces from different parts of the state, getting them into the Bay Area and getting ready to disperse them if there's going to be a need. And at this particular time, I think once they finally get the phone lines in, you're going to see a lot of need.
All right, let me quickly tap whatever local expertise you have there, because I'm hearing that the worst damage, or severe damage at least, has taken place in San Jose and in Hollister. How far from San Francisco? What kind of population centers are we talking about?
Okay. We are looking at San Jose and Hollister. We're looking at, from what I understand, the epicenter was about 50 miles southeast. That is the preliminary report that I'm getting. Let's see, I'm looking at it here. 10 miles northeast of Santa Cruz, 10 miles south of San Jose. They're looking at major damage in those areas, but we haven't gotten any, we don't have any specific reports. The preliminary report that we do have from the Berkeley Seismology Center, the preliminary estimates are showing that it registered a 6.5. And I don't really know of any instances of severe damage in that area, but since we are located in the San Francisco area, we're very aware of what is happening here. We've got reporters on the scene in different areas in the Oakland area, and we've got a Bay Bureau, which I don't think we've heard from yet, but we're hoping to hear from them any minute now.
All right, Sidney, thank you very much. Standing by now is Bob Olson of the Seismic Safety Commission. Mr. Olson, what can you tell us about the earthquake itself?
Thank you very much. I would say that we've got a borderline regional catastrophe here. I'm very concerned about what you just mentioned, the areas that we're not hearing from. And that's the epicentral area, the San Jose, which is a very large metropolitan area, the Monterey Peninsula, the Hollister area, where the San Andreas, Hayward, and Calaveras Faults all come together. Plus, what's coming in here now is we're getting glimpses of widespread damage. Near the fire, we're seeing some collapsed buildings. There have been other shots of collapsed elevated freeways in San Francisco. And I'm very worried, given the time of day that this took place, about casualties in cars that may have been caught in those particular structures.
Mr. Olson, forgive my ignorance, but what does your organization do?
Well, I was the first director of the California Seismic Safety Commission, and now I'm a private consultant specializing in earthquake and natural hazards mitigation.
What is it we should be looking for now? We are looking, I mean, as you and I are speaking together right now, and I hope our viewers don't get the wrong impression. San Francisco is not totally on fire. Sometimes it looks that way when we get too much of a close-up there, but we are looking at one particular square block area of San Francisco that is in very, very bad shape. And indeed, there are some other fires in Berkeley and in Oakland. And Bob Olson, I don't know if you can still hear me. I guess we've just lost that line, and that's not too surprising. We're having trouble with telephone lines all over the region. What Bob Olson, who used to be the commissioner of the Seismic Safety Commission, was telling us is that perhaps the most alarming information of the night is not the information that we have, but the information that we do not have from areas like San Jose and Santa Cruz and Hollister. These are areas about 40, 50, 60 miles south of San Francisco, and therefore on the San Andreas Fault, right on the epicenter of this earthquake, which is registered between 6.5 and 6.9 on the Richter scale. No information at the moment from those areas, which could be, and I don't want to alarm people who have families in those areas, but that could be a sign that maybe the worst that has happened there is simply that the telephone system is out. But that is the area that we are most concerned about at the moment, although, as you can see, there is considerable damage in and around San Francisco. Standing by at the White House now is our White House correspondent, my colleague Britt Hume. What's the president doing, and what is the federal government doing or going to do, Britt?
Well, the president, to the extent that he could, has put the federal government in action tonight. He is retired to the family quarters here at the White House. Governor Sununu, his chief of staff, is monitoring the situation. He has called over one of the heads of the Federal Emergency Management Agency who came here and reported. Robert Morris is his name, and he said that the earthquake was a 6.9. That puts it at the highest of the range that we've been told, and that the epicenter was indeed 60 miles southeast of San Francisco. Morris has now returned apparently to the FEMA headquarters, which will be the Washington command post for such operations as are conducted here. Sununu also has reached Department of Defense officials and made sure that the Pentagon is ready to put troops, if necessary, into action. Nothing much more was said here about that, Ted, but I would regard that as a sign of the seriousness with which the White House regards the potential here.
Get the sense, Britt, that folks at the White House know any more about what's going on right now than we do? I don't mean that to sound like a snotty question. It's just at times like this, sometimes it's more difficult for them to get information than it is for us.
Well, I suspect that in terms of actually seeing anything, that those pictures from the Goodyear blimp are probably the best view of it that anybody in this town has had. I do know that Governor Sununu tried to reach officials in the governor's office in California. Governor Deukmejian was not at this dinner here tonight, which was like Republican governor's dinners, apparently out of the country. I could be wrong about that, but that was the information that the White House officials here had. And he got some details which go no further, really, than the details we have reported about the extent of the damage in the San Francisco area. And, of course, obviously the White House is watching with considerable alarm to see what has happened in the area south near the center of the earthquake.
All right, Britt Hume, thank you very much. I'm going to go back now to my colleague from ABC Sports, Al Michaels. This was to be the night, Al, that you reported on the third game of the World Series. Instead, here we are doing live and continuous coverage of what looks as though it may be quite a catastrophe in the Northern California area. Just bring us, and once again, we're looking at that picture, and I understand why we keep putting it up. It's a very dramatic-looking shot, but again, I don't want to leave people with the impression that San Francisco is ablaze. That is one relatively confined area of San Francisco, and there are other major incidents that have occurred, perhaps the biggest of which that we know about at the moment is that the bridge that connects Oakland and San Francisco, one portion of the upper span of that bridge has collapsed onto the lower span. But again, Al, one of the reasons we are staying on the air right now is because we do not yet have even preliminary casualty reports yet, and we'd like to give our audience some sense of how many, if any, people have been injured. Now, if you would sort of bring us up to speed, take it as you were doing a few moments ago when we talked, from where you first became aware of the fact that there was an earthquake, and then what happened during the course of the next hour or so out there at Candlestick Park.
Well, again, to reiterate, Ted, basically most of the crowd was here. They would have had 62,000 total, and I would suspect that 55 to 58,000 people were in the ballpark. It lasted, I would guess, around 30 seconds. Fortunately, there was no major jolt. It was more of a steady shake and roll. But there was a very definite sense, I'm sure, amongst people who lived in this area and have experienced these, that a jolt was imminent, a major jolt. As I mentioned before, there was a sense of us in the mezzanine with the upper deck above us and the lower deck below us of moving backwards and, in effect, collapsing upon the lower deck. There was a strange feeling in the stadium. There was, I would guess, an ooh and an ah. Again, I didn't really have the presence of mind to necessarily be that tuned into the collective gasps of 58,000. But then, as there normally is when you're with a large gathering during an earthquake, there were wry smiles, and in fact, 5 or 6 minutes after the quake, when we had lost power and didn't have to remain in the broadcast booth, Jim Palmer and Tim McCarver and I went out onto the back of the mezzanine area at Candlestick Park, and the fans were out there saying, gee, I hope they can get the game underway, and, hey, guys, do you think the Giants can come back? So at first, you're not quite sure what had taken place. And then the reality of it, of course, begins to settle in amongst the crowd. They then evacuated the crowd. It took them a good, I would estimate, 40 minutes before the announcement was made that the Candlestick should be evacuated. Strangely, very few people left the ballpark, and even more strangely, I think, very few people got out onto the field. Perhaps they were not allowed out onto the field, but I mean, if we were ever, God forbid, to have a situation like this take place again in a major American arena, they should immediately let everybody get out onto the field, which probably would have been the safest place for everybody to be at Candlestick Park. And then everybody sort of filed out when the game was postponed officially. Again, fortunately, there was no panic, there was no crowding, none of that. As far as I can tell, there have been no injuries at Candlestick Park. Again, I'm sure they will be checking for structural damage. As to what will happen to the rest of the World Series, I wouldn't have a clue at this point, Ted, because the problems in this area are far larger right now than the resumption of play in the World Series.
Al Michaels, as we've been saying periodically throughout the course of this evening, one of the reasons that we have not yet been able to bring you any casualty reports, and I am assuming that there will have been some casualties, although, as you pointed out, fortunately, they do not appear to have been any at Candlestick Park itself. As soon as we get any casualty reports, we will, of course, bring them to you. But let me explain once again what is getting in the way of collecting any of that information. The phone lines are down. There is very bad communication. One of the miracles is that you and I are still able to communicate at all, and that we're able to see you and get that picture and get some of those remarkable aerial shots from the Goodyear blimp. It looked at one point as though there was almost an emotional aftershock there at the stadium. We saw some of the players with their wives, and a couple of the wives quite literally in tears, as ball players did what everybody else does in a situation like that. You start to look for your family. You try to get everybody together again. You start counting heads. We're looking at some of that videotape now of some of the ball players with their youngsters. You want to take us through that?
Right. Well, I can see Storm Davis, the Oakland pitcher, and you're exactly right. What had happened, Ted, is that, and there, I believe, is Terry Steinbach. Yes, that is, and his wife, and Mark McGuire, and Faye Vincent is in your picture right now, the commissioner of baseball. It took a while for it to settle in before everybody really realized what had taken place, and then the wives were allowed to go down onto the playing field and join their husbands, and the children came down as well, and everybody, as I say, very orderly filed out of the park. You know, one thing about earthquakes, Ted, is that you're not sure how close to the epicenter you are. So, in fact, had we been at the epicenter of this quake tonight, not this particular quake, but let's say that there had been a small earthquake at Candlestick Park in the neighborhood of 2.8 or 3.2, there would have been there would have been no damage here, very little anyplace else. So I think that was perhaps the sense of what people had. You begin to feel you were at the epicenter, and if you were, this would have been a very, very small quake. Where it's centered near Candlestick Park. You have no idea, of course, where the epicenter was, and as I stated before, once I knew it was in the 6 range, you knew as a Californian that it had to be 75 to 100 miles away at least, because all of the damage is done near the epicenter, most of it.
Let me just interrupt you for one moment. Once again, we're getting that extraordinary aerial shot from the blimp of the fire in the marina area. That's not too far from the Golden Gate Bridge, which I believe those are the lights of the Golden Gate Bridge that you can see in the background there. I am told that the fire in the marina area, that fire that you're looking at, appears to be gas-fed. And the fire department in San Francisco is not putting water on the fire because that would dampen it down, obviously. That would be the good news, but the bad news would be that dampening it down would create fumes, which in turn could cause a major explosion. So what they're trying to do, what the fire department is trying to do, is to protect the surrounding buildings, but they can't put fire on the, they can't put water, rather, on the main fire itself until the gas leak itself is capped. Now, how they're going to do that, as you look at that fire, you can see what an extraordinary blaze it is. How they're going to cap the gas leak, I do not know. Al Michaels, you know, you were talking a moment ago about the orderly fashion in which Candlestick Park was evacuated. In point of fact, I don't know if you're aware, but at one time the police inside Candlestick Park were urging people not to leave the park, to stay there, because they said the building itself, the structure, is structurally sound, and apparently they believe it is a fairly good place to be in an earthquake.
Well,
go ahead, Al.
Well, I think they would have been remarkably prescient to be able to predict that and not predict and not take into effect what might have been a large aftershock or aftershocks. I think it was more a case in retrospect here, Ted, of it being a very good idea that the police did what they did, at least to avoid panic, because now that I begin to think about it, had somebody come on with a panic-stricken announcement to evacuate, you can imagine what it would be like in a stadium that would hold in excess of 55,000 people, a stadium with relatively small aisles. Again, this was a ballpark built before a lot of the modern stadiums of today, which have
Al, forgive me for interrupting you. I don't know if you can. We're looking at some street scenes right now. Do you have a network line in front of you? Can
yes,
you
I
see
do.
what we're looking at?
I can see. I can.
All right.
Yes,
so you can see there really has been some extraordinary damage. Do you happen to recognize that area?
Well, that appears to me to either be the area we're seeing right now in those live shots from above. The houses in the area in which that fire is taking place right now are similar in style to those. Again, I can't tell you for certain that that is tape there of what you are seeing or what we have been seeing live, but it appears to me to be in the neighborhood and similar to the types of homes that would be involved in the inferno that we've seen in the Marina District.
Well, indeed, you were saying a moment ago that it is a residential area. That clearly looks like a residential area, and quite frankly, the way that fire looked and the way those buildings were cracked, it would be consistent with everything we've heard. Let me just say again, because we've spent so much time looking at that fire this evening, that apparently what the fire department is doing is quite deliberately not dousing that inferno with water, because of their fear that by dousing the fire, they would create toxic fumes that would be spread all over the area, and that ironically would be even more dangerous than the fire. Al, if you would, just sort of set the stage for us again, timing in terms of when this happened, how it happened, and what's happened, although it now seems almost trivial to be talking about the World Series, what in fact has happened to the series.
Well, everybody in San Francisco just euphoric, and throughout the Bay Area we've documented that, and I'm sure people know how excited this entire area was to have the whole World Series being played here. So there was a sense of celebration, and everybody was filing into Candlestick Park, and it was to have been the first World Series game to be played at Candlestick Park in 27 years. And we were just coming on the air. We have a pregame show that begins at 5 o'clock. I think first pitch was scheduled in the neighborhood of 5:20 or 5:25. And so the crowd was still filing in, and people, I'm sure, were still parking their cars. Some of them, even though, as I mentioned, most of the people appeared to have been in the stadium, they were about ready, as I recall, on the field to introduce the lineups, to introduce the crowd to the players. They had a band playing, and it was just a very celebratory type of mood that had permeated Candlestick at that point. When
absolutely stricken, and the only thing that he could say was that he was happy he was not in his hotel because his room is on the 45th floor of that hotel. As we have passed through the city, there have been some people outside in their yards and on the street. At the moment, there have been, where we are on this overpass above Interstate 280, above the freeway, some people have been looking off into San Francisco, but things appear strangely normal in the neighborhoods through which we've passed. I only heard one burglar alarm that appeared to have been set off by the earthquake.
And Bob, you've never been through an earthquake before, I don't think. I've known you a long time. I don't remember any of that in your stories. What was it like for you?
Well, One in Japan, Tom. You don't know everything about me. But this was quite an experience, because this one was so sudden and so violent. And I thought immediately what it was, but then my first thought was, here I am at the top of this stadium. This thing could just collapse like a souffle, and what would happen? But after that passed, I watched what was going on around me and had the sensation that we were just rolling, as though we were on the sea.
Well, one of the advantages that you had is that Candlestick Park, of course, was built at a time when they were conscious of the need to construct those large structures with an eye toward the possibility of just what happened tonight. That is what we all know about earthquakes, of course, is they strike without warning, and there is no real means now of predicting how and when and where they're going to strike, although San Francisco has been a target for a long time. It is heavily laced with earthquake faults, and the famous or infamous, depending on your point of view, San Andreas fault runs just south of San Francisco and runs right down along the peninsula, and it was very near the San Andreas fault, if not on it, that this earthquake between 6.5 and 7.0 on the Richter scale occurred tonight in the Santa Cruz area. It's worth pointing out we have not yet heard directly from people in that area. We are concentrating our attention on the heavily populated San Francisco area, but there's also Berkeley and San Jose and Carmel and Santa Cruz and San Rafael, all those areas north of San Francisco, as well as north of there. Fred Krimgold from Virginia Tech, I think it is, if I've got that right.
Yes, that's right.
The fact of the matter is that the San Francisco area is laced heavily with earthquakes, is it not? And if it strikes in one, it's liable to radiate throughout the rest of the fault.
Well, the two primary fault systems in the Bay Area are the San Andreas fault, which goes up through San Francisco, through the peninsula, and out to sea, and in the East Bay, the Hayward fault. These two faults meet at approximately at San Jose, and there is a experience from 1906 of an event along the San Andreas fault, which, as you remember, caused fires. Fire has been a significant concern in San Francisco because we have a densely packed, largely wooden city. And in response to that risk, there's been a great deal of emphasis placed on the development of specialized firefighting capacity.
Mr. Krimgold, we're going to look right down on these faults, courtesy of PBS now. You can actually see them in the topography of Northern California. You can see where the land changes, in effect, can't you?
Yes, that's true. That is motion along the San Andreas fault that's being shown just now.
We're told that they could feel this in Sacramento, which is 95 miles away, also in Reno, Nevada, which is 225 miles to the east. It knocked out phones, including electricity, throughout the wider Bay Area, and that does include, as I say, Oakland and Berkeley and San Rafael and San Jose and Sonoma County, which is just north of there. Many of those areas have had their own very severe earthquakes in the past. Is the San Francisco area as conducive to receiving damage from an epicenter as far away as Santa Cruz as, say, what happened in Los Angeles in the early 70s when it struck in the San Fernando Valley and there was like a jello-like effect as it moved through there?
The Sumar earthquake in 1971 is somewhat smaller than the reports of this earthquake so far. And the damage there was quite extensive. A total of 64 people were killed in that earthquake, and the damage totaled over $500 million. It appears already from the pictures that we've seen that this earthquake is considerably more damaging, and what I'm particularly concerned about is that so far we've only seen pictures from San Francisco, which is relatively far from the epicenter. It would be very important, I think, for us to look closer to the epicenter, to look at the area around Santa Cruz, to look at the area between San Jose and Monterey. We may find that there's a great deal of damage in that area, which is as yet unreported. Another factor which has to be borne in mind here is the effect of local soil conditions. and the relationship of local soil conditions to the behavior of particular building types. The lessons of Armenia and of the 1985 Mexico City earthquake clearly point to a strong relationship between local site conditions and the possibility that an earthquake can have effect on buildings quite far distant from the epicenter if those buildings happen to be of similar period to the site on which they stand.
Fred Krimgold, thank you very much for being with us. We'll ask you to stand by there. He's an expert on earthquakes. He teaches at Virginia Tech. We're going to go now back to San Francisco, where the San Francisco Candlestick Park has been closed. Of course, we want to show you some videotape of that right now. It was the opening of the third game of the World Series when the earthquake struck there tonight. There has been structural damage to that park. You can see it just to the right of your picture. It's down near the San Francisco International Airport, which also has been closed. It probably has received some damage. President Bush has dispatched federal officials. They're on their way, we're told, now in government airplanes to the San Francisco area tonight. A portion of the San Francisco Bay Bridge has collapsed. Let's go now to our affiliate out there, which is doing the best that it can under very difficult circumstances. This is KRON or KCRA, which is in Sacramento. Are we at KRON? Yes, I think this is KCRA television, which is just 90 miles away in Sacramento, and they are able to get a live picture and some reporting done for us. Let's hear what they have to say.
This is again 6th and Brannan, which is south of Market.
A lot of brick buildings down there, a lot of brick walls down there.
One of the areas where there's a lot of unreinforced masonry buildings.
Yeah, at this time, we have Dr. Stempler and myself at this time have seen approximately 5 victims. Well, it was 5 victims. Our main concern at this time is not
now we're told
seeing right in here. This area right here, there doesn't appear to be any victims, in the parked cars. We're very fortunate right now. Well, our concern are the passerbys that have come through here. But there may be some underneath the debris, and underneath the debris, and that's what we're concerned about at this time. This really is a disaster. There doesn't appear to be any victims that was in the building itself, which we're very, very fortunate at this time. The victims, as I mentioned to you, range from various horrible ways of dying. It's just awful.
You think it was a sudden death situation?
Some of them definitely, yes. Some of them definitely, yes.
Have you found anybody who was alive that you were able to rescue?
No. The patient that I pulled out myself, we started CPR on, and the patient was warm and dry. Eventually, the person became cool and cold, but their eyes were dilated as I pulled them out, from probably hypoxemia. That's probably lack of oxygen. Other than that, there's nothing else I can really tell you here, okay?
What's your name, sir?
Jim Crabtree.
Title?
I'm a paramedic at the San Francisco Fire Department.
we have some updated information since that interview. 5 bodies have now confirmed been pulled from that wreckage, and they think there may be 3 more. This is 6th and Brannan and 6th and Townsend in the Mission District of San Francisco. 5 known dead. There may be 3 more there.
We're now going to switch you over to Suzanne Shaw. She's at Sutro Tower, and she's going to show us some video of the damage on the Bay Bridge. Suzanne?
Yes, well, we have just been hearing, as you've heard Evan and Emerald talk to one of our own employees who witnessed the Bay Bridge. If we roll that tape, we can show you what has happened. That bridge is expected to be impassable for the next few days. There is a 50-foot section of the upper deck of the Bay Bridge which collapsed onto and through the lower section. Again, 2 50-foot sections, upper and lower, collapsed on the Bay Bridge. I'm not seeing a picture now. I don't know if you are. We are operating. Okay, you are. Obviously, power is very limited. We're working off primarily batteries and generators at this point. When we get that footage rolling again, we'll let you see it. As we've heard several different reports about the Bay Bridge problem, we know that cars were rerouted and sent back to either San Francisco or Oakland, the direction from which they came. But there were 2 cars that could be seen trapped, in fact, smashed from that upper deck collapse. It was not the steel structure of the bridge which collapsed. It was the pavement which gave through. So the steel structure is apparently intact, but again, several days before they expect to use the Bay Bridge at all. the red and white ferry fleet is offering free rides down at the Jack London Square area to and from San Francisco for those who need to cross the bridge at that point. Other bridges in this area, in fact, every other bridge in the Bay Area except for San Mateo is working. Now let's go back to Evan and Emerald back there in the studio.
Stand by. Stand by. You're on. Thank you.
Okay, that was Suzanne Shaw reporting from the Sutro Tower to show us what had happened on the Bay Bridge. And joining us now is Bob Costas of NBC Sports. Were you at Candlestick?
Yeah, I was in the press box right alongside the ABC broadcasting position, and it shook. It shook pretty well. And you got that reaction of nervous laughter from people at first. Yeah, after all, the people I was surrounded with are news people. They tend to be, as a group, sports writers tend to be cynical, and they were nervous titters at first. But then after it stopped, you saw the blood drain from people's faces, and they couldn't hide how shaken they were by it. And then you wonder, especially those who are not natives of this area and have no background in having been through earthquakes or hearing other people talk about it, they wonder what's next, if that was just the prelude to something bigger. And people were definitely very shaken.
Did you see any structural damage to Candlestick or any injuries?
No, I didn't see any injuries or structural damage. There was about 45 minutes after the tremor hit, there was a rumor of some structural damage in the upper deck, and that began spreading around the parking lots, and you heard people talking about that, but I didn't see any of it myself.
What was it like with the people try to leave the stadium in a pandemonium? We had video 45 minutes later that showed people walking out in a rather orderly way, but what was it like right after?
Everything I saw was orderly, Emerald. There was nothing that would even approach chaos or pandemonium. In fact, I think the initial reaction was, all right, this is hit, now it's over, and people were sort of tentative. There was no one big rush for the aisles or for the exits. People began to come out in dribs and drabs, and I didn't see people hysterical. They, as I said before, they appeared shaken. And then what happened, little by little, would be that word would spread through the parking lot and then eventually back into the ballpark, people having gone out to their cars and listened to radios or portable television sets, and you would see little groups of people gathered around the hood of a car on which would be resting a television set, a little TV, or the door of a car open, listening to the car radio, and then you would see the looks of concern on their faces when they heard that a part of the Bay Bridge had collapsed, or that there were fires in parts of San Francisco and in Oakland. And then there was the report that came much later of a building having collapsed downtown and fallen on top of some cars, and I guess you've had that on the air already. And when those reports spread, then you saw not panic, but tremendous concern. I think at the very beginning, as people started to come out of the park, their initial reaction was, we were just in the middle of something that we'll look back on as having been fun. And I don't say that glibly. But then when the reports, because at first when they came out, they thought, well, all right, the building shook, they might have to call the game off, but nobody's hurt, everybody's fine. But then when they started to get those reports of what was happening elsewhere, then they realized the gravity of the situation, and obviously those who were natives of this area began to wonder if it might involve their family or their friends, and that's when you started to see expressions change and those looks of great concern come over people's faces.
The natural tendency, of course, I guess, at first is if you survive it, then you think everything's okay. And like you said, when they started hearing about the extent of the damage and the injuries elsewhere, then it really called for concern. There are reports that most of the people are stuck out at Candlestick, that they can't get out of the parking lot. Was that the situation when you left?
Well, I left, I would say, about an hour after it hit. They're saying, what, it hit at about 5:05? At about 6 o'clock, I was able to come creeping out of there. My car was able to get out. I would imagine those that lingered longer are probably stuck. Maybe they closed some roadways. You might know better than I.
So you got out by driving onto 101 and coming north?
That's right. Yeah. What you'd also saw was players. As I came out around the players' entrance in the parking lot, you saw a lot of Giant and Oakland players milling around. And their concern, understandably, was for their families, because in a situation like this, you might be in a place where the ground shook a little, but there wasn't anything terrible that happened to you, but you might wonder what might have happened in another location. And ball players have their friends and families scattered all over the park. Somebody like me, I look around and I'm okay, I'm all in one piece, and I might feel fine. But there's a nursery area where small children and families stay that's in one part of the ballpark. Wives or children might have been in the stands in another part. So you saw a lot of players concerned not for themselves, but not resting easy until they had gathered all their family and friends around them.
As you
Gus
go
Bob
back
Costas,
on 101
of
into the
NBC
city,
Sports, is being interviewed by a reporter for KRON in San Francisco. They're doing an extraordinary job under very difficult circumstances. There was a major earthquake in the San Francisco area tonight, actually south of there. The epicenter was in Santa Cruz. For those of you familiar with Northern California, that's down on the peninsula near Carmel and Monterey. 6.9 on the Richter scale, maybe as high as 7. Among other things, the San Francisco to Oakland Bay Bridge, portions of that collapsed. We'll show you pictures of that right now. We do not have an exact death toll yet, although we do have 5 people confirmed dead in the San Francisco area. At least 1 died when the bridge collapsed. Other cars may have gone into the bay. We cannot say at this time. They're still sorting out the extent of the damage and the nature of it and where it occurred. We are showing you primarily pictures from San Francisco, but we do remind you a wide area was affected. All the way north to Sacramento, all the way east to Reno, and certainly in the Santa Cruz, Monterey, Carmel area. Jimmy Cephalo is at Candlestick Park, where the 3rd game of the World Series was canceled tonight after the earthquake struck that area and did a fair amount of structural damage to Candlestick Park, which is the home of the San Francisco Giants, of course. Jimmy Cephalo is there right now. Jimmy, I continue to ask about aftershocks and how people are reacting. Bring us up to date on both counts, if you would.
Tom, just a quick update from Candlestick Park. When the quake took place about 2 hours ago, most of the fans inside, there were about 45,000 fans inside, another 15 out here in the parking lot. They left in an orderly manner. There was virtually no panic here at Candlestick Park, surprisingly so. I spoke to a couple of the ball players. They were in the locker room when the quake occurred. The teams gathered. They asked the normal questions: how are our families? What's going on in the Bay Area? There are about 10 to 12,000 fans remaining here in the parking lot at Candlestick. But again, it has been virtually no panic here at Candlestick Park. And we continue, the fans here that surround the park, continue to ask questions about the overall Bay Area. We're a bit cut off, but again, no panic at all here at Candlestick. Tom?
All right, thank you very much. Jimmy Cephalo, who is at Candlestick Park tonight. That is between the city of San Francisco and the San Francisco International Airport, which has been closed. All air traffic now has been diverted to Stockton, we are told. You're looking at portions of pictures that were recorded earlier of a neighborhood in San Francisco, not too far from Fisherman's Wharf. We believe that this kind of damage has been largely confined to that neighborhood. We have not yet heard of any widespread fires or structural damage throughout the city, although major buildings were shaken very severely. And, of course, a lot of the pre-war and immediate post-war construction in that beautiful city, which Herb Cain has called Baghdad by the Bay, they may be damaged as well. Bob Jamieson is somewhere in San Francisco on the streets, on a car phone right now, working his way toward this area. Bob, bring us up to date on what you're seeing.
I'm in downtown San Francisco now, Tom, and at the moment power continues to be out, although there is evidence of some emergency lights coming on in some of the buildings. There are some police and some volunteers directing traffic at intersections because all of the traffic lights are out. There is a great amount of traffic on the streets, people clustered on street corners, groups of 10 and 15 people, a number of people walking on the street, but it all appears to be very calm, and in the areas that we have traveled through, there doesn't appear to be much evidence of damage. Public transportation, which, as you know, relies on BART, on motorized buses, and on trolley cars, is pretty well paralyzed.
Thank you very much, Bob Jamieson, who is in a car in San Francisco at this hour. We just don't know how many people have been hurt or injured or have died in all of this. We have very spotty figures at this hour. We are told 7 people. We just heard some very dramatic testimony just a few moments ago from a San Francisco fireman who talked about pulling people from a brick building that collapsed. It appeared to me to be right near the entrance to the Oakland Bay Bridge. That would make it on the south side of San Francisco as you're heading toward the airport. And some of that construction is not as strong there as it might be in other parts of the city. San Francisco is one of those cities in California that has paid a lot of attention to its construction. Fred Krimgold is an associate dean of the School of Architecture in Virginia Tech. He pays a lot of attention to architecture, and he pays a lot of attention to what goes on in earthquake areas. The Bay Bridge And is that the Bay Bridge that we're looking at, or is that the San Mateo Bridge? I'm not sure. It looks more to me like the San Mateo Bridge, quite honestly, folks. We're getting this picture in as we talk. I don't think that's the Bay Bridge. I could be wrong. But it does look more like the San Mateo Bridge or one of the other bridges up and down. What about the bridges in the San Francisco Bay Area, whether the Bay Bridge or San Mateo or San Rafael or whatever, Mr. Krimgold? Are they in pretty good shape?
The bridges are certainly a sensitive point because the city of San Francisco is isolated on 3 sides without the service of the bridges. These bridges were constructed, for the most part, during the 30s, and earthquake considerations were certainly recognized in the design of those bridges.
And they have long spans. They go over a long piece of water. Certainly that's the case in the San Francisco Bay Bridge. I was on it this Saturday and Saturday evening going back and forth to the ball game, and I'm always struck by the fact that you go all the way from the city of San Francisco to Treasure Island and then on to Oakland. You're over a big piece of water there.
Yes. I think this is the first time that this structure has sustained any such damage. So that is an indication of the seriousness of the earthquake. It is also possible that as the bridge has aged, that it has become marginally more susceptible to such damage. But I think that the damage in bridges has certainly been a major concern for the engineering community and for the Bay Area.
Thank you very much, Fred Krimgold, Associate Dean of the School of Architecture at Virginia Tech and an expert on earthquakes. We're going to go back now to our affiliate in San Francisco, which is under very trying circumstances, staying on the air now, bringing us up to date on what's going on in that area. We want to remind you that most of the damage does seem confined to the Bay Area Bridge, to a neighborhood just near the approach to the Bay Area Bridge, and to the Fisherman's Wharf area, about a 2-square-block area there in San Francisco. We do not know yet what's going on in Santa Cruz, San Rafael, Oakland, and Berkeley, although they have closed the state capitol, we're told, in Sacramento. Let's go back now to KRON.
Bay Area people are wonderful. They were standing on the street side, consoling one another, really trying to be helpful.
All the video we've seen from that area did show people quite calm and collected in the immediate aftermath of the earthquake. Were there fires downtown?
No fires downtown, just a lot of gas leaks because the gas lines went, and they lost water pressure. And the firemen kept saying, thank God there's not a fire because we don't have any water. And I thought...
Did you get as far as 100 California?
I did. And part of that building, the whole side of it, had gone down. You could see the 2 stories visible from the outside where it had collapsed, but fortunately no one was hurt, and no one was hurt seriously.
There were reports of looting going on at the Embarcadero Center. Were you...
We saw no looting. We checked with the Embarcadero. They said they had heard that, but no one had actually witnessed it.
We're going to roll the tape, apparently, you brought back with you from Union Square, so as they show the folks at home the video, maybe you can describe it.
Well, Magnus, of course, is the oldest building down on the square, and it was the only one that suffered extensive damage. Just below this, people who were trying to go into the building were the ones who were injured the most. Amazingly, one of the newest buildings lost no glass. This is a building on Front Street where bricks just rained down on people, but no one said they were seriously hurt. People were still dazed. Many went into bars and did what San Franciscans do.
I only want to talk
there was a gas leak just around this area also. But basically, people just stood on the street corners dazed, and many just went into Union Square. You can see what traffic is like down in the financial district.
Bill, but you mentioned that parts of buildings had collapsed. Did they fall on cars or people?
The one in California fell on some cars, but they had just towed them away. I meant the emergency services in this town were really operating. As you can see, police were just racing through town, putting up these caution signs to keep people from walking under parts of these fallen buildings. But as you can see, without the signs, they were continuing to do that. As night fell, things became a little bit scarier down there, especially on the waterfront, as people tried to make their way down toward the ferry building. You can see this is the Citicorp building where all of these bricks came down from the side of this wall. One gentleman told me that these 2 buildings literally separated and then came back together. And then you've got the foliage of bricks down to the street. It just sheared off a tree And luckily, you know, it was after 4 o'clock, so there's no parking along most of these streets. So that's why there were not really that many cars in that area.
I mean, given the length of the earthquake and the 7-point severity of it, I'm struck by how little damage, in fact, there is.
Yes, well, this is what we saw happening all over the city. Because if you, the sidewalks and the roadways are all cracked so badly, they were shutting off as many gas mains as they could. So firemen were all over town trying to shut off these gas mains. But wherever we looked, buildings were cracked and plaster was down, and this was another serious gas leak again. And the big thing was to keep people with cigarettes away from this area. But you can see here, see how the roadway separated right down the middle of there. That's on Sacramento Street, right down by the Embarcadero Freeway. This is the roadway which was had fallen apart there. And people who were on it said they rode a roller coaster throughout that whole thing.
Were you able to get anywhere near, or did you hear anything about Chinatown? Because that's where there's a lot of concern with the weak buildings there and the...
I don't want you to miss this. This is the ferry building. Oh. You can see what happened to the flagpole at the ferry building. I understand there's extensive damage to that whole tower there, but you could just see what it looked like.
And it's from the ferry building that now the red and white fleet is offering service across the bay to Jack London.
And there are hundreds of people lined up down there. But the unfortunate part is that the street is flooded through most of that area. So you see people taking off their shoes or taking off their socks. This is at the Golden State Bank building, and that's where a couple of floors collapsed one onto the other. And as you can see, the firemen are there trying to make sure that people don't come into that area. Basically, it's right next to Harrington's Bar, so I think Harrington's offered everybody refreshments thereafter, so they just stood around watching the firemen try to pull it together in true San Francisco tradition. But that building was damaged extensively.
What about the people inside?
There were only people, it's a bank, and there were only people on the first floor. If you could see, there was a police sign on there, so there were no people on those floors. These are the people who'd been in some of those buildings down there who now had moved across the street.
With beer from Harris.
With beer from Harris, yes, right. I mean, with the thousands of people in the downtown area, it was just an amazing thing to watch how people just assembled and were orderly, and we saw no sign of people looting. This gentleman was on the
I was standing near the glass, and people said, get away from the glass, and I was afraid to walk away from the glass. I started to walk, and I couldn't stand up, and I saw dust out towards Candlestick. It was really crazy. I've never been anything like that, a big building. It was really scary.
Have you been through any others in San Francisco?
Well, no, I haven't. I've been one in Menlo Park, and I was walking across, and it was noticeable, but nothing like this, especially way up there. I can't imagine a big building can move like that, up and down. You know, 50 stories. No, it happened so fast I was too stupid to get scared.
Would you say your name for me?
Yeah, John Hesse.
Where are you from?
I live in Moss Beach, down on the coast.
Gas leak was. This whole area was just, the smell of gas just covered it totally. And there was some concern because of the fire right down on Beach Street. You can see we're right down by the waterfront there. Firefighters were working with PG&E workmen to try to get main gas.
Well, we have been watching pictures from our affiliate in San Francisco, KRON, and they've been doing an exceptional Herculean job under very trying circumstances. Power has been on an emergency backup basis there. What we just saw was a kind of a roundup of the city, if you will, by one of their reporters. She was out and about. As you could see, the damage does seem to be confined only to a few specific areas in San Francisco, but we hasten to point out we do not yet know, and we are working on this, what happened in the Santa Cruz, Carmel, Monterey area. That's down on the peninsula south of San Francisco, the epicenter of the earthquake. We do not yet know what happened in the Berkeley, Oakland, San Rafael area, although it does not seem there was major damage there, or we probably would have heard about it. The Bay Area Bridge did collapse in 2 sections. There was structural damage to Candlestick Park. Buildings are down in San Francisco. At least 5, possibly as many as 7 deaths so far. That toll could go considerably higher. It does seem that a 2-square block area just south of Fisherman's Wharf is suffering the greatest damage in the city itself, fires and some collapsed apartment houses and residential areas there. by and large, the city of San Francisco, which was rebuilt after 1906 and the great earthquake that occurred then, which was above 8 at that time, has been put back together in pretty good form. We still don't know, however, what happened in Santa Cruz. I did hear one earlier radio report of highways being buckled. Robert Brazil is our NBC News science correspondent. He is in Orlando tonight, where he has been awaiting the liftoff of the Atlanta shuttle, postponed until tomorrow. And Bob, let's talk for just a few moments, if we can, about earthquakes and the Richter scale. Let's begin with that. 6.9 is what we're hearing. That is a major shaker.
It certainly is, Tom. That's as big as the earthquake that hit Armenia and did a considerable amount of damage. But, of course, as we discussed on the air at the time, Armenia didn't have the kind of building code that San Francisco did. One of the things that's interesting about this earthquake is that it was kind of eerily forecast very recently in a federal government report that talked about where the damage might be. And it did point out that those faults in the South Bay were at great risk, and so much attention had been focused on the next big one hitting Los Angeles, and the San Francisco Bay Area had been ignored. So I think that that's one of the things that this highlights, that in fact there are a lot of faults that can cause a lot of damage in a lot of places in California.
Bob, we are looking now at a map of California, and you and I will have to give a verbal description of this, but the San Andreas Fault goes down from the lower corner of that picture on the right-hand side, and it goes right up along the coastline there. I think we're looking at it. That's the leftmost fault line that you are seeing, and then it goes out to sea, correct?
That's correct, but I think, Tom, at this point, and obviously it doesn't matter so much in terms of the damage, but this earthquake may have not been on the San Andreas Fault. It could have been on the Hayward Fault, which is the one you see over there near Oakland, or a series of other faults in the area that are capable of causing as much damage.
Well, the one thing we do know, Bob, is that the epicenter was in Santa Cruz, is what they're saying tonight, so that does seem to place it closer, at least, to the San Andreas Fault. This is what the fault line looks like. You can actually see it if you've ever been in that area. It runs very close to Edwards Air Force Base, which is where the shuttle lands, of course, and it runs straight up north through San Francisco and along the peninsula, and it does move, although that movement is not visible to the naked eye, except during dramatic occurrences such as an earthquake, but it does move every year, and there is a kind of ironic joke about northern and southern California moving ever closer to each other as they pass along.
Yeah, this is true. There is constant movement on these faults. One of the things, of course, that this points out as well is that the science of earthquake prediction doesn't do a whole lot. There's been a lot of study of all those faults. Like I said, there was a recent report predicting that the South Bay was a great deal more risk than most people had thought, but this certainly wasn't predicted. It was as big a surprise as most earthquakes are, and 6.9 is a very, very serious earthquake.
I can tell you, as someone who's been through, 4 or 5, I guess, earthquakes in Southern California, most of them minor, the one big shaker that we had in the early 70s, of course, in the northern San Fernando Valley. There is nothing quite like it. It is the single most frightening experience that I have ever witnessed, short of being shot at, I suppose. But what happens is that you think that you can always count on Mother Earth, that it will be still. And it begins to move, and there is simply no place to hide. You can run into a door frame, which is what you're told to do, or outside or whatever, but if the Earth continues to shake, as it did quite dramatically tonight, and think of those 60,000 fans at Candlestick Park in the upper tiers when that began to happen. There is no hiding place, and you do not know when it's going to begin, and it comes very unexpectedly. So I think it is one of the single most frightening things that can happen to a human being. Bob Bazell, let's talk some more, if we can, about the San Francisco area specifically and some of the construction that exists there. The Golden Gate Bridge, which was built pre-World War II, as I recall, and the other bridges seem to have withstood this, but in the Bay Bridge, a couple of the sections did come down.
Yeah, one of the big concerns, Tom, in San Francisco has been the enormous amount of landfill that's been put in over the years for a long period of time. San Francisco Bay used to be a lot bigger than it was, and over the years, in order to fill in areas and create more real estate, there's been a lot of filling in, and often landfill tends to behave like Jell-O, and it will vibrate much more than a rocky surface. And I think one of the things that you might have seen in that area, which apparently was around the Marina district of San Francisco, which is, I think, on landfill, where there was apparently the worst damage in the city itself, is that that may have been the result of that, although, of course, a lot of this is speculation at this time. Another thing is I have some information to add. I have gotten through this evening to some relatives who live in the peninsula in the South Bay. The damage in San Mateo County, I understand, was not terribly severe. I heard that dishes fell off the wall, walls cracked, and that sort of thing, but I haven't heard any reports of serious structural damage of the kind that we've seen on the pictures in San Francisco. But again, and as you cautioned on the air, information is very sketchy from the Santa Cruz area where the epicenter seems to be.
All right, Bob, we'll ask you to stand by. We're going to show you some more pictures now as they become available to us. This is from KRON, which is our affiliate in San Francisco. Again, this is very familiar-looking housing. We believe that this is in that neighborhood, which is down near the Fisherman's Wharf area. It does look to us to be Divisadero or Chestnut Street or one of those residential areas. You can see a couple of apartment houses have collapsed in the background. Most of these apartments, my guess is, are about 40 years old, maybe a little older, probably built before the code was as strict as it now is. People out in the streets. San Francisco is a city that lives cheek by jowl. It is a unique American city in that the apartment houses and the houses are almost all common wall because there's not a lot of physical space. So what you're looking at is typical San Francisco housing. Streets are buckled, pretty severely in this case. And this is down near the marina, near the Embarcadero. You come into the city and you go out to the kind of north edge of it. This is what you would find. That's a lot of damage, and we don't know about the extent of injuries or deaths to people who are living in those homes. We do know that one building near the entrance to the Bay Bridge in another part of San Francisco, which would be the south part, did collapse. At least 5, possibly 6 people were killed there. Another person, we believe, was killed on the San Francisco Bay Bridge when a portion of it collapsed, but astoundingly and gratefully, 60-some thousand fans at Candlestick Park tonight. The ballpark itself did suffer some damage. No one hurt or injured or killed there, we're told. The third game of the World Series, however, was understandably canceled. When it can be rescheduled, we don't know. We don't know what happened in Oakland tonight, for that matter. Bob Jamieson of NBC News on the streets of San Francisco. Bob, where are you now and what are you seeing?
Well, I'm on Van Ness, and I can give you one bit of information that we have heard from Oakland, that is that there has been extensive damage to Interstate 880, which, as I understand it, would be what, Tom, beyond the Bay Bridge, right, perhaps near the Oakland Coliseum.
Right, it would be. Actually, it runs right beside the Oakland Coliseum.
And there have been reports of extensive interstate highway damage in other areas and of some street damage in downtown San Francisco.
Bob, I'm going to interrupt you for a moment because we're seeing our first really close-up pictures of what happened on what we think is the Bay Bridge. A whole section has collapsed there. This is the upper tier of the Bay Bridge, which reaches between Oakland, Berkeley, and San Francisco. Whether anyone was on that particular section when it went down, we don't know. The damage may not have been as great as it could have been because it appears that it's been stabilized when it hit the lower deck. That happened, we think, in a couple of parts of the Oakland Bay Bridge. You can see cars down below that are stopped and possibly one that has been crushed. Yes, a red car that you can see that has been collapsed there. Must have been a truly frightening moment for the drivers of those cars when that happened. A big fear in California when earthquakes occur is what happens in overpasses and underpasses on the freeways. That was a lot of the damage of what happened in Southern California during the big earthquake there in the early 70s. This, we think, is the Oakland Bay Bridge and one of the collapsed sections, at least one, and it looks like 2 cars trapped there. Another section of the freeway now. See, I can't tell exactly where that is. That does look like it's the approach to the bridge, and that has really been severely buckled. As you can see, it has just been turned into a ribbon, if you will, by this 6.9 on the Richter scale earthquake that occurred. Yes, it does appear to be, and then another section just to the left of your picture, which is even more severely collapsed.
dramatic video, but the mayor says the city has had relatively minor damage. All vital facilities, he says, are operational. The fire chief, public health director, and police chief are all at the command center.
KRON, which is our affiliate in San Francisco, live reports right now.
All under control.
Unfortunately, I have a new fire that just handed me. There's a major fire. It's near Page Mill Road. That's in the Palo Alto area. That's south of San Francisco, halfway to San Jose, near the Stanford campus. A major fire at Page Mill Road. We have no details as to what is burning
Also
there.
earlier reports of a major fire in Berkeley, building engulfed in flames over there. In Richmond, the city of Richmond to the north, several buildings had collapsed over there. From the Marin side over in Sonoma, we were told there were no injuries over there. And again in San Francisco, right now there's a problem in the Marina district with firefighters having trouble controlling that fire, people trapped inside buildings too.
If there's not enough problem on the Bay Bridge, the video you just saw of its collapse, now the approaches to the Bay Bridge are also in trouble. On the eastern end of the Bay Bridge is a toll plaza, and that is Highway 580. That highway is cracked and buckled. It is at sea level. Excuse me, it's where the bay is. Water is now coming onto the roadway and into that area at the toll plaza. So this is where we got the information, in fact, that the bridge
One
will be down
engineer
for
says
some
that it could be weeks before the bridge is open again. And we heard earlier from our production assistant, Claudia Gomez, who was on the Bay Bridge when the earthquake hit, and she described it, well, first of all, she said there was a tremendous jolt. She was on a bus, and then everyone thought it was okay, and they drove on, and then about 10 seconds later, everything came to stop. People were getting out of their cars, they had seen that collapsed section, and people fled the bridge. And now we're joined by Rita Channon.
Just back from San Francisco Airport, which is closed. We should say that San Jose is open and Oakland is open. Moffett Field is open. San Francisco is closed?
San Francisco is closed. No incoming flights, no outgoing flights. All of the terminals have been evacuated. And needless to say, a lot of confused people out on the street as we got there right after the quake. Everyone was taken out of the terminals, told to get out of there as best they could. They didn't know where they were going, but just to get away from it, not to go back in because they were worried about aftershocks. Now, some of these people were, of course, trying to make connecting flights. They didn't know where some family was. Some of the taxi drivers, though, showed a lot of heart by saying, anybody's hurt, come on, I'll take you to a hospital. But here you can see the falling tile. If the shot were a little wider, you could see that the doors are off their hinges, that everything's broken away. There were a lot of people that were injured simply from what you see there. A lot of falling debris, a lot of broken glass. And as I rushed in to use a phone, the phones weren't working too well, but the man said, get out of here later, I'm going to throw you out. So they were doing a pretty good job. There is a huge gas leak in one of the terminals, and they were worried very much about that and trying to get people out, especially if they were smoking. Once again, you will see a lot of people just walking down toward Highway 101 trying to get out of there, to get through the city, to find out what was going on. Just mass confusion, but I must say that people handled themselves very well, and security at the airport really rose to the occasion and kept everyone as calm as possible. And at this point, a lot of people are just trying to get transportation out. And people finally gave up on that, started simply walking down the ramp to get to the highway.
We are listening in on and sharing the work of KRON, which is our San Francisco affiliate. They're doing the best that they can under very trying circumstances. Emergency backup power in that city, which has been hit very hard by an earthquake which struck in the Santa Cruz area, south of San Francisco, in the peninsula area near Monterey and Carmel, 6.9 on the Richter scale. That is a very big shaker. At least 7 people. We just don't know how high this toll may go because we've not gotten very reliable reports, either from San Francisco and certainly from the outlying areas, either the epicenter of Santa Cruz or Oakland or San Rafael or wherever. We're going to go now to the National Earthquake Center. A man from Golden, Colorado, I think, John Perugia, is going to tell us about who we of KCNC, is going to tell us who we're going to be talking to and what we're going to learn about earthquakes in the San Francisco area. John?
Well, Tom, I'm with Waverly Person, who is here at the center, and his major concern now after this rather large earthquake is the aftershock.
And Waverly, as a geophysicist, what's the concern with the aftershocks?
With an earthquake of this size, we would expect to have the aftershocks, and some of them could be in the moderate size. So far, we have had several aftershocks, some of them large enough to be felt, but certainly we have not had any significant aftershocks at this point.
In the next 48 hours, 72 hours, you were talking about the possibility of a 5.5. What would that mean if there was such an aftershock?
That kind of an aftershock of that size could cause additional damage. Buildings that have been damaged from the main shock could be further damaged from an aftershock of that size. Looking at an earthquake, say the one that was in Armenia, we had a magnitude 6.8 there last December, and then 4 minutes later we had a 5.9, so what the 6.8 did not bring down, the 5.9 did. And if we get aftershocks in this area in the 5 range, it could be additional damage.
In your professional opinion, how likely is it that we're going to see these major aftershocks?
Well, it's very hard to say. So far, we haven't seen them, and as long as we go, maybe without seeing them, maybe the possibility of having the strong ones might lessen. But over the next several days, we'll be watching the area very closely.
Around here, people are working kind of feverishly, answering phones. We've seen lots of equipment around here. How far away was this shock recorded?
This earthquake was recorded around the world, and we have heard from many of the foreign countries magnitude 6.9 is strong enough to be recorded throughout the world.
And how far was it felt?
So far, we have it being felt in Nevada and throughout California. That's the extent of the felt that we've had, but been recorded throughout the world.
Waverly Person, thanks very much. Back to you, Tom.
Thank you very much, John Perugia in Denver, Colorado tonight with our station KCNC out there and a representative of the National Earthquake Center. Lieutenant Governor Leo McCarthy, who is on duty for the state of California, says that there are 40 people dead on Route 880, which is the interstate which runs right beside Oakland, California. We are told that it was severely hit by this earthquake tonight. That has not yet been absolutely confirmed. That certainly is the worst news that we have heard tonight from the San Francisco Bay Area. 40 dead in the collapse of Route 880. We will work now to see if we can't get some absolute confirmation of that, some more details on it. Route 880 runs right beside the Oakland Coliseum, which is where the baseball game would be played if the series were to go on. Tonight, of course, it was canceled or at least postponed for a long time when the earthquake struck during pregame ceremonies at Candlestick Park just across the bay in San Francisco. So this is what we know at this hour. An earthquake with an epicenter near Santa Cruz, California, south of San Francisco on the peninsula. 6.9, a very big earthquake. Hit that area at about 5:04 Pacific time. That would make it 7:04 in the Midwest and 8:04 in the East. And there has been a lot of structural damage to bridges and highways. And in the city of San Francisco, we cannot yet tell you what is going on. We do have reports of fires in Berkeley, but we don't know what has happened in Monterey or in Carmel or in Santa Cruz itself, which is the home of one of the branches of the University of California. But we do have this report of 40 dead on Route 880, at least 5 dead in San Francisco, and possibly 1 or 2 dead when two sections of the San Francisco to Oakland Bay Bridge collapsed. This is what President Bush had to say earlier this evening when he was informed of this growing tragedy in the Northern California area.
It's still coming in, so we don't know. John called the governor's office and got some information there. The governor's out of the country, but we're beginning to get a lot of information in here. And obviously the federal government will do everything that possibly can to help. But at this point, we're just assessing. You've got the latest report.
The governor's office said they had some information on some scattered fires. No confirmation exactly what the specific damage to the bridge was, although there is some damage that has warranted the closing of the bridge. There seems to be power out at the airport in some of the major components of the airport. So the airport is either operating at a very low level or shut down. It may be shut down.
You may want this delayed. They just handed me a report if you want to take a look at that. Well, I don't know about tonight, but the team will be working here to see how we can assist.
Nothing different than what I've just said. Skinner will be going out.
President Bush tonight speaking at a dinner when he was informed that there had been this tragic earthquake in the Northern California area, and he has dispatched federal officials, including Transportation Secretary Samuel Skinner, to that area in government airplanes. We have some additional tape for you. We will tell you as well that the most immediate news that we have is that Lieutenant Governor Leo McCarthy of of California, is saying that at least 40 people were killed in the collapse of Interstate 880, which is in the Oakland area.
There are 3 others trapped in the rubble.
This is KRON now describing what their reporters are bringing back to the station.
The whole wall of the building came down. The firemen tried to give CPR to some victims. This is an area of a number of old buildings in San Francisco. Most of your brick buildings have been forced to...
In a car was going anywhere.
That's the airport in San Francisco, which has been closed down, obviously. Also, Candlestick Park has been closed. This may be the evacuation of the park itself. They're both in relatively the same area. Californians are a hardy breed, obviously. They're used to small earthquakes from time to time. They've had them in Northern California over the years. Anyone who has lived out there has experienced them, but nothing like a 6.9 shaker has struck that area in a very, very long time. If you're wondering, it was 1906 when the big San Francisco earthquake struck that leveled that city, a series of disastrous fires, and of course, an earthquake that was over 8 on what we now know as the Richter scale. We continue to point out to you that we do not know what has happened, specifically in some of those areas south and essentially east of San Francisco in the peninsula area where the epicenter occurred. It does seem that most of the damage, and we're hearing this from the mayor, Art Agnos of San Francisco as well, has pretty much been controlled now in that area, although some fires continue to burn out of control. We're getting these really frightening reports from the Oakland Bay area of at least 40 people killed in the collapse of Interstate 880, which runs alongside the San Francisco Bay and the city of Oakland itself. I'm Tom Brokaw, NBC News, and we will have continuing coverage of this earthquake tragedy in Northern California on this NBC station.
Nothing in this great big world, nothing that ever will feel as good as the good you feel.
Of the Bay Area, the fires are reported to be mostly under control in San Francisco. This is an isolated section of the affluent northwest area of the Bay region where there are older, less quake-protected homes. You can see the collapsed foundations, the buildings going out into the road area. We'll tell you the center of the quake was near Santa Cruz, about 50 miles south of San Francisco. We are not getting much in way of reports from that particular area, mostly from San Francisco. Buildings collapsed, sections of roads and bridges. You can see the cracks of the roads there. There are reports of up to a half dozen people killed when a building collapsed on their vehicles. The death of another person where 2 sections of the Bay Bridge collapsed. More fires here. We believe that natural gas lines bursting during the quake are responsible for the fires that you're seeing. While the quake was primarily in the San Francisco area, it was felt as far away as 400 miles away in Los Angeles, 225 miles away to the east in Reno, Nevada. The jolt sent many people fleeing from subway systems. There are unconfirmed reports, this is unconfirmed reports of a collapsed shopping mall in San Jose, 50 miles south of San Francisco. These, again, close-up shots of the fires that we understand now are being brought under control by firemen in San Francisco. The quake hit as a nationwide television audience was waiting for the 3rd game of the World Series to begin. And you're looking now at the Bay Bridge, which partially collapsed. And the 3rd game of the World Series is where we got this reaction.
I was thinking, well, it's just another earthquake. Let's go watch the ball game. Hey, no problem. You know, California, I'm used to it. And go up there, and once I saw them take the balloons out of there, it was all over.
How would this compare to other earthquakes, you think?
You know, we were standing underneath the standards, and going from side to side, I've been through a 6.1 and a 5.5, and I'm sure the people upstairs were feeling a lot worse.
Man, the buses man, the buses are like this, man.
My friend's sitting in the van, says, "What are you shaking the van for?" I said, "I'm not shaking the van." We look over, the bus is swaying back and forth, and the ground's rippling up and down. Whoa.
Individuals at Candlestick Park, where the third game of the World Series was forced to be postponed by the earthquake, and the reaction of those people, which was rather upbeat, I think belies the seriousness of this particular earthquake. I think if they could do that over again, once they know the seriousness of the damage, it would not be quite so upbeat. As we said, there are at least 40 people dead. There was official reaction from the president at the White House tonight, where NBC's Jim Nikolashevsky was following Mr. Bush, and here's what Nikolashevsky heard from the president.
The acting director of FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Association, Robert Morris, immediately went to the White House to give President Bush and Governor John Sununu an update on the situation there. And FEMA has now set up a command headquarters at its building here in Washington to continue to monitor and coordinate all federal disaster relief programs. The president has also ordered Transportation Secretary Samuel Skinner to head out to San Francisco to assess the damage, and we're told that he'll probably leave on an FAA aircraft sometime early tomorrow morning.
And should we get further information on the San Francisco earthquake, we, of course, here at Newswatch 12 or NBC will give it to you as the night progresses. Ann?
Locally.
Good evening, everyone. The first video of damage we saw showed a collapsed part of the Bay Bridge that connects Oakland to San Francisco. At least one person was killed here.
I was on the bus and thought we blew a tire. Turns out, I guess there was a huge earthquake. The bus was swerving. The bus stopped. I looked outside. This is what I saw. I jumped off the bus, ran over, and pulled these people out of their cars.
Here in the part of San Francisco known as the Marina section, a major fire is still burning out of control. This one apparently started after gas lines ruptured. And in another section of town, a top section of a building tumbled over onto the street below, crashing into cars. Late reports say at least 6 people were crushed here.
I was standing by the window and saw everything shaking, and then all of a sudden saw a ton of concrete come crashing down into the street. And it exploded as it hit the street. There wasn't anybody standing around. It almost looked like a war had broken out.
The quake also hit just as tonight's third World Series game was about to begin here at Candlestick Park. As players rushed to check on their families, the stadium was being evacuated. There have been reports of injuries here, as well as possible damage to the stadium itself.
It threw me over my son into the aisle. People started screaming where I was. And then we could hear people saying, "Be calm, be calm." Husbands and wives are grabbing each other. I grabbed my son. We just
10 miles north of the coastal resort of Santa Cruz. That's about 50 miles south of San Francisco. The quake was felt as far east as Reno, Nevada, about 200 miles away, and as far south as Fresno, California, about 120 miles to the southeast.
Well, as we mentioned, it's still very early to give you an accurate tally of fatalities within the San Francisco area itself. As we mentioned, at least 6 people were killed and the building collapsed, 1 on the bridge. What we can tell you that if you're trying to reach friends or relatives in the San Francisco Bay Area, be patient. AT&T reports lines are down everywhere and circuits are full. And of course, Cynthia, earlier tonight, of course, a number of people here at the station were trying to call relatives in San Francisco to little avail. And of course, ABC and WGH Piedmont News will be covering this story throughout the evening and bringing you more information as it becomes available.
Might mention that
is a banker and has a stronger back.
A section of the Bay Bridge connecting Oakland and San Francisco collapses. As many as 40 people killed in their cars as an Oakland highway collapses. And in San Francisco tonight, electricity is out, there are gas leaks, and dozens of fires. Good evening, I'm Ted Koppel in Washington, and this is Nightline. What we're going to be doing tonight, obviously, is a continuation of our story. All evening long. I'm going to go now immediately to my colleague Sydney Kohara out at KGO in San Francisco and have her bring you up to date on what is happening out there. Sydney?
Hello, Ted. I can see you, but I can't exactly hear you at this particular point. But what I want to do right now is just kind of go through, even though I don't know if you're asking me questions, I'll let you know what we do know at this point. I wish I could tell you, I wish I had better news at this particular time, but the news I'm getting at this time is grim. What we're looking at now, I told you a little bit earlier about the I-880. That is a part of a freeway in Oakland that collapsed on top of another part of that freeway. We are looking at 40 to 50 dead in that particular accident. We had 30 to 40 ambulances going through that area. This is in Oakland across the bay. Now, this isn't counting the Bay Bridge accident. We know that there is one confirmed dead there. We also had in San Francisco, there are 7 confirmed dead south of Market, which is just to the south part of the Bay Bridge that comes into the city. Also, you know that there was the huge fire in the Marina District, which is very close to the Golden Gate Bridge. It is between the Golden Gate Bridge and the downtown area. There is a huge fire there. They have no word of fatalities. What you're looking at now is some videotape a little bit earlier of that spectacular fire in the Marina District. Earlier when we talked, I couldn't really tell you why I thought those buildings had collapsed when I was in a 6-story building not but a mile away, and things seemed to be fine. What I understand now is that part of the city, the Marina District, very close to the Golden Gate Bridge, is built on a landfill, so it's not very stable. Those buildings would, I assume, be the first to collapse. The scary part, too, is a lot of problems with some natural gas in that area. I understand that throughout the streets of San Francisco, there is a very heavy smell of natural gas, and there are people that are still walking around a little bit dazed, not sure what to do. It's particularly frightening, too, in that area because while there are a lot of so-called yuppie neighborhood, there are a lot of elderly people that live there. So, unfortunately, I would imagine that the death toll is going to go higher in that area until they can finally get some crews in there and they can figure out get all the people accounted for at this time. But we do know that there are 40 to 50 confirmed dead now on the I-880, the Nimitz Freeway in Oakland.
All right. Sydney, can you hear me now?
Yes, now I can hear you.
All right, very good. Thank you very much. We may be coming back to you a little bit later. That, incidentally, we're looking right now at the Bay Bridge, which connects Oakland and San Francisco. And those of you who are just joining us, we have shown this several times during the course of the evening. You can see where a segment of the upper level of that bridge literally collapsed onto the lower segment. There, I assume that's in downtown San Francisco. We're looking at one of the major department stores there, I-Magnum, and you can see that there has been tremendous damage with shattered glass. But perhaps the best way to give you a sense of what has been happening is not just to show you the pictures, but let you see the faces and hear the voices of San Franciscans and Bay Area residents and how they have reacted to today's earthquake in San Francisco.
Attempted to drive over this 50-foot gap in the Bay Bridge. It has been like a drama here. It has been dangling from the edge, the precipice behind me, and these folks are just getting rescued right now. It's been about an hour-long effort. It's been a frightening scene here. As you can see, just below me is where this crack in the Bay Bridge occurred, a 50-foot section. You see down there below the two cars that were on the upper deck when the bridge collapsed. They fell below. We understand that the people in both of those cars did get out safely.
I'm at the corner of Jefferson and Divisadero. You can see this building is collapsed. They don't know if people are still in there or if they aren't. You can see the fire down past me. What has happened is that the natural gas lines have ruptured, and that is what has caused that fire. The water lines have ruptured. There is no water coming out of the fire hydrants. People are running into this building that Randy's now showing you, and they are looking for people. They're asking for people to come by. They're saying that people are still trapped in there. We were down at number 2 Cervantes. Another building like this one had collapsed. I had 2 deaths confirmed there.
We'll go back to the Marina District. As we told you earlier, this is obviously an area that has been very hard hit. Fire crews coming into this inferno as apartment buildings collapsed. Remember, the Marina District was filled for is landfill, and therefore a number of the very expensive apartments and townhouses in this area have collapsed. Fire burning unchecked. They're trying. It's been very difficult. There have been some injuries, it appears, perhaps more panic than anything else as they try to evacuate them from the homes, but the fire burns on. San Francisco's Marina District and Inferno.
We're painting on the second floor and everything just started shaking, and it's a plaster and lath building, and just whole sheets of plaster were coming off the ceiling and the walls. And I was in the bathroom painting, Randy was in the living room. I ran to the bathroom door and stood there, and he was trying to get into a doorway, and the floor was falling at such an angle that it made him fall down.
Again, you see the Marina District, the Jefferson to Visadero area, where these very expensive buildings have collapsed, and the fire continues as the San Francisco Fire Department tries to fight it. This was a 4-story building, and that's the kind of problem. They are trying to evacuate people who may have been inside. A lot of people at home at that time or during the commute hour, as the earthquake struck at 5:04 this afternoon in Northern California. We have an unofficial word, or it perhaps is official now. 7 people, we know 7 people have died in this crash, including the one, or in this quake rather, including the one when an old building south of Market collapsed on people in automobiles. And there is one other death, too, perhaps one on the Bay Bridge when that section of it collapsed. But here trying to get people out of their homes, some injuries, perhaps just panic as well. And this, if it indeed is the big one that we've heard so much about, and people trying to do whatever they can to stop the fire. But part of the problem, obviously, is gas.
Electricity, store water, prepare for aftershock, prepare for 3 days of no services. You got 90 minutes of light left. You better make use of your time. Standing here ain't doing nothing.
It's looking bad over here in Oakland. The electricity is out in much of the city, and we have a bad freeway collapse. It's that ramp of the Nimitz Freeway that goes from Cypress Street on up to the Bay Bridge. About a 6 or 7 block stretch of it collapsed during the earthquake. There have been ambulances going in and out of here all evening long. We understand as many as 30 or 40 ambulances, and preliminary reports right now are that there may be as many as 8 to 40 dead. 8 to 40 dead, many others injured. This, again, is a stretch of the freeway. The upper ramp collapsed onto the lower ramp. And we understand that the columns gave way. Those columns began to crumble and sway, and the freeway collapsed down. We're waiting to get in a little closer and get some official word for you, but it is a disastrous scene over here in Oakland.
Now, what you've been looking at, of course, is a compilation of some of the reporting that's been done by our colleagues out at KGO in San Francisco, anchors and reporters on the scene, and some of the information is already dated, as we now know that well over 50 people appear to have died just in the Bay Area alone. In that one area of that ramp of the Highway 880 leading onto the Bay Bridge, the collapse of that highway alone appears to have cost as many as 40 dead. All of this didn't begin, but we became aware of it in most of the country when we were watching what we thought was going to be the beginning of the 3rd game of the World Series between the Oakland Athletics and the San Francisco Giants. And we saw my colleague, Al Michaels, who was just about to begin the coverage of that game when suddenly, Al Michaels, you're standing by now out at, where are you, Al? I'm sorry, you and I have been talking all evening, but I'm not quite sure where you are at the moment.
I'm right outside our production truck, right next to Candlestick Park.
All right, so there you were at Candlestick Park, ready to do your usual fine job of bringing us the game. And no game tonight because things just got out of control very, very quickly. Tell us what happened, would you?
Well, we talked about this earlier, Ted. I can't stress how lucky and how fortunate we were to avert a major, major disaster. The fact that the epicenter was...
The traffic jam, a great deal of confusion, although very little panic taking place. There are still thousands and thousands of fans here at Candlestick Park.
Probably on the San Andreas Fault, although that is not yet clear. And we have heard from the Santa Cruz area that highways have been buckled there as well. They don't have quite as many overpasses as they do in the San Francisco-Oakland Bay area, and of course that's the great damage if those overpasses collapse one onto the other. It's happened in 2 instances tonight, both on the city side and on the Oakland Bay Bridge side, and we have now a death toll, unofficially, of about 100 people. The Lieutenant Governor saying 40 dying on Interstate 880 on the Oakland Bay Bridge side, and then our reporters at KRON saying that probably another 50 to 55 people died on one of the on-ramps, the Cypress Bridge, I think, on-ramp going south on Interstate 101 towards San Jose out of the city. It probably happened right around the rush hour. NBC News science correspondent Robert Bazell is in Florida tonight, where he was assigned to cover the liftoff of the space shuttle Atlantis, now postponed until tomorrow afternoon. He has been reading a lot of government reports recently on earthquakes. And, Bob, I guess the most frightening thing that we've heard in terms of looking toward the future, the same people who wrote the report saying that the South Bay area of San Francisco was going to be next, and indeed it has been, say that there is a 60% chance of a big quake hitting Southern California in the next 30 years. Those are pretty short odds.
Yeah, those are the odds indeed, Tom. 880 and Route 17, which is an approach to the Bay Bridge. 5 people who were killed in the collapse of that building in the Jefferson Divisadero area. 2 killed in Santa Cruz, and I think that adds up to 60. There is also talk, Tom, that several hundred were injured.
What are their names?
Several hundred. I've heard one figure of 400, but that's something we cannot confirm. In addition to that, Tom, the Jefferson Divisadero area, I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, has been evacuated or is in the process of being evacuated so that there can be safety checks conducted in that area near Fisherman's Wharf.
All right, and how are they doing on that fire? We're looking at pictures of it right now. This is videotape from earlier, but I gather they're having a hard time bringing it under control.
We are told that it is now contained.
Okay. That's good news. Bob Jamieson, okay, bringing us up to date on that. The highway, it's 880 and Highway 17. That's the approach to the Oakland Bay Bridge. Those are that's the confined area. Bob is now saying at about 60 people, probably the death toll at this hour. J.J. Hudson and Larry Spiro are 2 ham radio operators at WRC in Washington. They've been talking to some fellow ham operators in the Northern California area. J.J. and Larry, what are they telling you about what's going on out there?
Well, Tom, what they're basically saying is that it's hard to get messages in and out of San Francisco right now. We've been copying a lot of traffic, trying to get into San Francisco and trying to get out. The phone lines, of course, are dead to long-distance traffic. And, Larry, we've even heard, a gentleman on a boat in the West Indies trying to get information about his mother in San Francisco.
Correct. We've heard amateur radio operators all over the world, from the West Indies to Hawaii, trying to call into San Francisco to check on the health and welfare of people in the city.
And one interesting note, there was also one hospital that they were trying to evacuate people from. There was some concern about the structural integrity.
That's correct. We understand that there's a hospital in Watsonville, California, and one in the San Francisco area south that has been evacuated because they are fearful that the building may collapse. So they have evacuated a couple of hospitals in the area.
Yeah, but for the time being, it seems, Tom, that much of the attempts to get information into San Francisco are not working right now. As a matter of fact, they don't want people trying to make calls in there because it's overloading the system back there. Back to you.
All right, thank you very much, I.J. Hudson and Larry Spiro. We're going to go back now and join the continuing coverage tonight of KRON, which is our affiliate in San Francisco. They are on top of the story. They're using emergency facilities, and they're on the air right now. Let's hear what they have to say. This is the fire in San Francisco. We think now it has been contained. That's the latest from Bob Jamieson, although we cannot be sure. Bob reporting that death toll now probably about 60, most of it confined to Highway 17 and Route 880 on the Oakland Bay Bridge side. That's the approach to the Oakland Bay Bridge. This is the scene in San Francisco tonight. We want to repeat to you, however, that we believe that this kind of damage is largely confined to just one neighborhood there. We have been saying repeatedly it is the neighborhood that is on the north side of the city, just north of the so-called North Beach area, the Broadway area, which was celebrated in the past for its peep shows and so on, and then north of there is Fisherman's Wharf. Somewhere between North Beach and Fisherman's Wharf, we believe, is where that neighborhood is. And Bob Jamieson standing by. The city now coming under control?
Contacts are kin with our local Red Cross chapters in the San Francisco and up and down the coast. especially our larger chapters that have the resources to send people in to help for those chapters that have been affected. We already have people on the way, and as you know, we have about 1,200 people in the Caribbean and in the Carolinas.
Kelly is standing by via satellite to update us on what's going on in San Francisco. Ron?
Well, MKM on the west side of the bay, San Francisco. It's the scenic and the culturally rich area downtown San Francisco that got hit the hardest by the earthquake. It is impossible right now still to accurately account for the dead and the injured, impossible to account for the amount of damage to buildings and streets. There's still too much digging out to do.
Well, are people being allowed to travel through the streets or certain areas cordoned off?
Certain areas are cordoned off. Many of the streets leading into the area, only emergency personnel and people who may live in the area and they own buildings in the area, have property in the area, are being allowed in and out. The city itself reacted very well to a plea by leaders saying that don't come to downtown San Francisco unless you absolutely have to. And for that reason, it has helped out in the cleanup all along today.
Well, Ron, have emergency officials been able to estimate any type of damage figures for the Bay Area?
Not at all, not at all. One of the problems is that many of the buildings, we can see buildings that were collapsed. We know that they are gone, that they are damaged. But there are many of those older, picturesque buildings in San Francisco that have been slightly shifted and are on the brink of perhaps collapse. And those are the ones that they don't know about yet. They're not letting anybody in.
Well, it's going to take a little time to figure all that out. Thanks for keeping track of it, Ron.
You bet, Lee.
Thank you.
All righty. And please stay tuned to WFMY-TV for further developments on the West Coast.
Also, be sure to join us at 8 o'clock tonight when CBS brings you a special broadcast on the devastating quake.
Well, while much of the nation is directing its attention to the West Coast,
when the big story hits the coast or shakes the...
Northern California, the morning after, a scene of natural beauty in the Pacific sky. On the ground below, scenes of a natural disaster.
Back far enough where you can see it fall down. And you knew all the cars in front of it are gone.
The deadliest earthquake in the United States in more than 80 years kills close to 300 people as it snaps roadways into pieces, reduces buildings to rubble, and touches off fires.
At this point, we don't know whether they're living or dead. We haven't heard from them, so obviously something is wrong.
Brave rescue workers risk their own lives in hopes of saving others.
I don't know how the hell we're going to get them out.
This is a CBS News special report, part of our continuing coverage of the San Francisco earthquake. From Oakland, here is Dan Rabbit.
Good evening. This broadcast comes to you live from Oakland, California, across the bay from San Francisco, the night after the great earthquake of 1989. No, it was not the big one that has been predicted for so long. One expert said tonight, when the big one comes, it'll be 30 times larger than the one last evening. This one was big enough, certainly big enough for anybody here. It was big enough to bring cities in Northern California to their knees, electricity out for long periods of time, hundreds of thousands of people afraid to use the gas and other utilities. Death, destruction, not everywhere, but a lot of it. And if, when the big one comes, it's bigger than this one, certainly a lot of people around here don't want to be here when it does come. This earthquake was also big enough to kill more than 250 people in one place, and that place is right here, right back there, Highway 880 in Oakland. What happened is the top part of the highway came crashing down on a roadway below, and literally hundreds of people were trapped and killed in their cars when that happened. Understand that when an earthquake happens, there's this tremendous sway and roll like nothing you have ever felt before in your life. And particularly, I think if you're in an automobile, there's a strangeness to it, especially if you haven't been through it before. And remember, this earthquake is one of the largest ever in this country. It's registered officially 6.9 on the Richter scale, with the epicenter just north of Santa Cruz, California, which is below San Francisco, and Oakland. And the great San Francisco earthquake of 1906, the one that is storied about the fires that followed and all of that. There wasn't a Richter scale then, but it's believed it was on the order of maybe 8.2 or 3 or even higher. This one was 6.9, and perhaps only the Missouri earthquake of a century and a half or so ago was on a level with this one in terms of its tremendous intensity. No one argues that this was one of the largest earthquakes ever to hit a populated area in North America. That's one of the things that's made it so bad. One of the impressive things that you see and hear and feel around here is the way these communities and these people are pulling together. And you see it right back here, last night and today. Workers with blisters on their hands, working with it back in their hands, with everything they could find to try to pull people out of those automobiles. And when the mayor, a good and decent person here in Oakland, said this morning, for good and decent reason, listen, I don't think there are any more survivors in there, they cursed him and went back to work. Threw themselves into this rescue effort with tremendous fury, and it's still going on, as you can see and hear around us. Well, that's part of the scene as Northern California continues trying to tally up the toll and try to measure what to do next in the wake of this very large earthquake. Now, our CBS News correspondent stationed in San Francisco is John Blackstone. He was here as the city went through the great earthquake of '89. John?
Those of us who live here live with the knowledge that it can happen, but that doesn't reduce the shock, of course, for any of us when it actually does happen. As you know, Dan, many people who live here say this part of California is so beautiful that they're willing to live with the risk.
From across the Golden Gate Bridge this morning, San Francisco was as beautiful as ever. But this is a city and a region in shock. By dawn, the fires were out in the Marina district of San Francisco. This neighborhood of comfortable and expensive houses is noted for its sunshine. But this morning, the sun could not soften the horror.
I just can't believe it. I just can't believe I just lost everything that I loved my animals.
Houses were rocked off their foundations. 3-story buildings collapsed to 1 story. Cars crushed. It was across the bay in Oakland that this earthquake became a tragedy of monumental proportions, killing more than 250 people along a 1.5-mile stretch of freeway. The quake struck at one of the busiest times of the day on one of the busiest roads in California. Rescuers have been searching the rubble for more than 24 hours now, but still, no one is sure how many cars and people were trapped when the double-decker freeway collapsed.
I don't know how the hell we're going to get them out, okay? We have one woman who's unconscious, bleeding from the head.
I knew our freeways would be damaged. That's part of our problems we have. They're old structures, designed and built in the 50s. But I've never thought that there would be as, it would be as extensive as what we saw.
The other major roadway collapse was on the Bay Bridge, the main artery linking Oakland and San Francisco. A 52-year-old bridge that carries hundreds of thousands of commuters every day. Just after the bridge started shaking, one driver started a home video camera rolling. California's Lieutenant Governor Leo McCarthy visited the wounded Bay Bridge and made a daringly close inspection of its damage.
The upper deck section doesn't appear to be the big problem. It's the lower deck section. They're probably going to have to rebuild that section from scratch. That could take up to 3 weeks.
The Bay Bridge was playing its own part in this year's Oakland-San Francisco World Series. The only traveling players and fans had to do was across the bridge. Now the bridge is out, and there are worries about the stadiums. Both were checked for damages today, and the 3rd game of the series has been postponed.
Obviously, there's been a substantial tragedy in this community, and baseball is not the highest priority.
Vice President Quayle was visiting Southern California when the earthquake hit. He flew north to inspect the damage and to promise speedy federal help. President Bush had already issued a disaster declaration making federal funds available. If there has been any good news, it is that so many buildings remained standing. Though San Francisco's main business and financial district was littered with fallen masonry and broken glass, the skyscrapers generally withstood the shaking, just as their designers believed they would.
The encouraging thing is that those buildings that were designed by modern standards perform very well. So we know we can design buildings to resist earthquakes. We know we can minimize damage. The difficult part is finding the money and the commitment to really do that.
The interest here in earthquake preparedness always rises sharply right after any earthquake. The high death toll in this one is a reminder that earthquake preparedness should be a full-time job in this geologically active part of the country. Dan?
Thank you, John Blackstone. As John mentioned, Vice President Quayle was put front and center in terms of the official White House and representing President Bush here today. The President himself has made it clear he plans to be here later on in the week. But in terms of visiting this earthquake-stricken area today, it was Vice President Quayle who did so. And after he toured parts of the disaster area, this is what the Vice President had to say.
Just looking at it, it is going to be a long-term operation. You have one highway on top of another that is simply glued together. That is a very severe result from this very dramatic earthquake.
Vice President of the United States, Dan Quayle, today after he'd made a tour here. With us live now from Oakland, California, as part of this CBS News special broadcast about the California earthquake is the United States Senator from California, one of them, Pete Wilson. Senator Wilson, thank you for being with us. Vice President Quayle was making the point that it's going to take a very long time to come back from this. How long, how much, and how do they do it?
Dan, there's no way to know at this point. You can only speculate. This appalling collapse of the bridge behind us, of the freeway, the double-decker, 18 months, 2 years, the cost, or whatever the current cost of total replacement. It was just appalling. When I first saw it, I said, my God, I don't believe it. The governor echoed that almost verbatim this afternoon when he saw it. But the good news is that the people have been magnificent. They have done, both the public, the firefighters trying to dig those people out, the volunteers who have worked all night in the Red Cross centers have just done a magnificent job.
They've done a magnificent job, but they need help. From where is that help going to come? Now, let's be candid. You're a person, and proud of it, who in the past sometimes said, listen, we need to reduce federal funds for some kind of social programs. You weren't talking about this kind of rebuilding program.
No, and I don't think anybody is. This is not just a social program, but in this instance, it has that dimension as well. We are going to have to spend money to replace this. Just as we're helping the citizens of South Carolina, those in Puerto Rico from Hugo, I think there's an obligation on those who were spared to do something to help those that weren't. We are going to have to do it. We're going to have to do it very, very fast, and but it won't happen fast. It's going to take a long time, and a lot of courage is going to have to be spent as well as dollars.
We have only a few seconds left here, Senator, but for people on the outside who are saying, I want to help, but I don't quite know what to do, what can they do?
They can send money to the Red Cross, to the Salvation Army, who are stretched thin between Hugo and this one, and that was a plea explicitly made this morning when Vice President Quayle was here, a Red Cross worker running one of the 14 shelters. She said, we need help, we need money.
Senator Pete Wilson, thank you very much. We appreciate you being with us. Of all the things that we've talked about today, we've over and over have shown you one piece of video, that was a home video taken by an amateur. We're going to do it again now because it again gives you a sense, a feel of being here during the earthquake. This piece of video was taken not back here, but it was taken on the Oakland Bay Bridge. It was the most dramatic evidence of the destructive power that an earthquake can make, particularly when you're in an automobile and on a bridge. One motorist died when a portion of the bridge collapsed into the lower deck. Now, we're talking about the Bay Bridge, not this freeway back here. This morning, station KPIX reporter Dave Rand ventured out on the bridge to report on the destruction on that bridge.
This is the area where the bridge has split. You can see up at the top of the bridge now, you have Caltrans engineers and workers are now going over the structural damage, and they are now actually beginning to work. Their concern is not the upper deck, it's the lower deck. And as our cameraman pans down, you can see why. The reason is you are looking at water. That is the lower deck of the Bay Bridge. It is split in half, the roadway, and you can see the water of the bay beneath us. The problem is that when this section of the upper deck collapsed onto the lower deck during the earthquake yesterday, it split the roadway in half and did extensive structural damage, and it could take perhaps 3 weeks or more to repair the damage. And you can see, again, this is part of the damaged upper deck of the bridge, which has collapsed onto the lower deck, and we're now panning around to show you, again, some of the damage. There is still one car here, And again, you can see where the roadway has split, and you can actually see the water now through the bridge.
We need a second input. Joining me now is the consumer reporter from CBS This Morning, Aaron Moriarty. Aaron, I gather that the engineers knew some time ago that this particular freeway, 880, might be trouble in case of an earthquake.
Absolutely. In fact, none of this really came as a surprise. Sorry, Dan, I had to grab a microphone.
Television.
I know it is live television.
The actual earthquake that occurred Tuesday night didn't come as a surprise to anyone. It had been predicted for years, and in fact, because of a similar one that occurred in 1971, the state officials knew how to prevent damage to bridges and highways. Unfortunately, they just didn't get it done in time.
Well, you see it in the movies, but you think it's just a movie. But when it happens, you realize how tragic it is.
For over 1.5 miles, the Nimitz Highway in Oakland stands as a stark reminder of how devastating a California earthquake can be. There have been earthquake provisions for more than 50 years in California building codes. So the buildings that were damaged were either very old or, in the case of this highway that leads to the Bay Bridge, never upgraded to withstand the kind of shock it received Tuesday night. The now crumbled concrete columns had been scheduled to be reinforced as part of a $60 million highway renovation program. But the earthquake hit before the work on this particular overpass could be started. And the shock, according to this structural engineer, may have been too much.
The concrete structures and the short-span steel truss bridges are excited by the earthquakes. And both those two structures were also sitting on very deep bay muds.
There are another 690 bridges in this state that need to be repaired before the next earthquake hits, or what happened on the Nimitz could happen again. State officials say that it could cost anywhere between $150 million to $200 million to rebuild this bridge, and in fact they have to tear it down and then rebuild it, and it could be out of commission for another year at least.
Aaron Moriarty, thanks, and you handled that well when the microphone was together. Join us at the moment, Mr. Robert Coleman, who is Deputy Head of the California Transportation Department of Highways and Bridges. Wanted to make sure I got your title correct, Mr. Coleman.
I'm Deputy District Director of Project Development in the Bay Area.
Very good. Thanks for joining us. Now, what about Aaron Moriarty's report here that you and other engineers knew some time ago that this kind of thing might happen, and indeed might happen to this very highway?
Well, we've never witnessed or have we expected to see this type of a failure. In the 1971 San Fernando earthquake, after that we made extensive efforts and a lot of research to go into and develop how to prevent the type of failure that occurred in that earthquake. This is a different type of failure. In fact, some of the hinges that were tied together after that earthquake based on that research actually have held. And there's some good examples scattered all through the Bay Area where the research as a result of that earthquake was successful.
I'm not quite sure that I know what you're telling us here. Is it that no matter what precautions you take and how many studies you do, when you have an earthquake of this kind, you're going to have this kind of thing? Or are you saying, well, yes, we can prevent it?
There's ongoing research, and we expect to learn from this. We expect to learn from this failure. We've got ongoing research today and a program, and I think that's what she was referring to look into how to prevent collapse of multiple column structures. So that is an ongoing research project.
Well, let's hope it goes on a little faster and succeeds. Thank you very much, Mr. Coates. Now, when we come back, we'll be taking a look at some of the death, damage, and destruction from the heavily populated area just south of here.
I just saw my apartment go right up in flames on the 3rd floor.
No, the Northern California Bay Area very well. There's a tendency to think of San Francisco as the only big city here, or perhaps San Francisco and Oakland. They are indeed big cities, but there's a huge population just south. It includes San Jose, Santa Cruz, the Silicon Valley, and that area was actually closer to the epicenter of this particular earthquake than San Francisco and Oakland. Now, CBS News reporter Ron Allen has been traveling, talking to people, and looking at the damage and the death toll in that section of Northern California. Ron?
Dan, the aftershocks and fallout from the quake are still being felt in those smaller communities to the south.
Those residents, as you pointed out, do live very close to the epicenter of the quake. There is considerable damage to buildings, bridges, and roadways are blocked. There has been some loss of life. Tonight, many people are without lights and power, and it could be that way for some time near the center of the quake. A team of geologists traveled to the epicenter, and contrary to what most people believe, those scientists now don't seem to think the huge San Andreas fault had anything to do with this massive earthquake. But residents in the South Bay did not care which fault or whose fault. They were concerned about the necessities of life. In small communities such as Santa Cruz and Los Gatos, people stood in line for bottled water because of shortages and fears that ruptured sewer lines contaminated the water supply. In downtown business districts, merchants worried about their livelihoods and arrived to inspect the damage. Windows were shattered. Brick walls had come tumbling down. Inspectors were busy making their rounds trying to determine which structures were safe. Buildings were condemned immediately, and some officials predicted that several blocks were beyond repair. Police barriers tried to keep looters away and warned residents that aftershocks could mean even more devastation. Just 26,000 people live in Los Gatos, and officials estimate the cost of the quake has already reached millions and millions of dollars in that town alone. Those towns will get some relief because they are on the list approved by President Bush for federal emergency assistance. But here, like in other parts of Northern California, it will take some time to assess the full extent of the damage. Many residents consider it remarkable that the number of confirmed deaths is only a handful here so close to the center of the quake. Dan?
Ron, we talked about the death toll. The official death toll, as best anyone can determine right now, the confirmed death toll is slightly above 270 people. That includes the 250-plus killed right on this Oakland Highway 880. And about 1,400 people confirmed with injuries. There was a report earlier that it was 2,400, but that's been trimmed back to 1,400. Everybody expects it to go up yet. This is the question, Ron. In that heavily populated area, some of which is rural, a lot of it is not, but some of which is, and which the reporting has not been very extensive yet, is there an expectation that the death toll will jump up considerably higher or not? And what about the toll of injured as well?
I don't think there is any expectation that the death toll will change. I think that people are just struck by the fact that there were not more fatalities reported so close to the center of the quake. It's an oddity that some scientists are having some difficulty explaining, but I don't think there is any expectation that the death toll will change.
Ron Allen, thanks. Veteran CBS News correspondent Bob McNamara has been in another section of Northern California below San Francisco and Oakland, the area of Santa Cruz, reminding that Santa Cruz was very close to the epicenter. The epicenter itself was either on the cusp of the San Andreas fault or in the fault itself. There's some dispute now, some controversy among the experts of whether it was actually in the fault or not. We perhaps will have more about that later. But right now, let's go to Bob McNamara, who's been assessing the damage and the death and injury toll in and around Santa Cruz, California. Bob?
Dan, I think the biggest problem is one of the major reasons why there were any fatalities down there, down south of San Francisco, was the fact that most of the people who died in older buildings, older homes. Most of the business places in Santa Cruz, they were over 80 years old. The facades came down. The ceilings collapsed. Those were the people who died there. The people who died in their homes, basically, those homes were leveled.
Bob McNamara in Santa Cruz. Question, what about the possibility of the death toll taking a dramatic jump up in that area, or is that unlikely to occur?
I think that's very unlikely. I think that they have found all of the bodies. I think everybody has been accounted for. I don't think it'll ever go up again.
Bob, one of the things we're seeing here in the Oakland, San Francisco area is a tremendous sense of people pulling together and working together to dig out from under this. You find the same thing there?
Everywhere. Everywhere. Everybody has a story to tell, and they share it. And people who didn't know each other, who live next door to each other, or just down the street, who never talked to each other for 5, 6 years, however long they've lived there. This has brought them together. They're now talking together. They finally have a community. They have a sense of belonging, and they have something to talk about.
Thanks a lot, Tom. Now, We'll be back in a moment with more of our CBS News special broadcast live from California on the earthquake, so stay here with us.
And then I came and approached Fillmore and Bay, and I saw the building collapse there, and then I realized that we had an earthquake.
Is a regular contributor, and he's been covering the earthquake and its aftermath, particularly from the standpoint of medical care and what's been happening in the hospital. Dr. Bob Arnott, I was impressed last night when we were calling one hospital after another, and you got a calm voice and said, well, we have problems, like the electricity is out. We're not sure the water's going to work. But let me tell you, Dan, things are all right here. Yes, we have some injured. In hospital after hospital, that was the experience.
Well, this disaster plan seemed to work particularly well because they planned. They practiced even last August for it. And when they came down to the crunch, they'd expected thousands of patients, and of course they just had a few here or there at the different hospitals. If there was only, I guess, one shortcoming, it was the communication system, which quickly became overloaded. And I think those that were hurt the most were those with the least severely injured who ended up waiting the longest.
What else should we know about the medical situation?
I'm okay.
What happened to you?
Well, the earthquake threw me off the bed and my dresser fell on my hip.
You okay, do you think?
I hope so.
15 hours after the quake, the injured were still arriving at Highland Hospital, Oakland's main trauma center. Minor injuries like this one had to wait as doctors tried to cope with victims of the quake's worst disaster. The collapse of Highway 880, where working conditions were next to impossible. Dr. Michael Smith, chief of trauma, was on site.
The top level of the bridge had crushed the car that he was in down to the point that it was 3 feet high or less.
Well, I believe that was the space they said they had to work in.
Wow.
And that was about the maximum, I'm told, that they had to work in. There were some other areas where they had some very small individuals trying to crawl between. It was almost an all-or-none phenomenon because it was either such a massive crush-type phenomena that you couldn't survive it, or you were hit by relatively small pieces of debris.
Some were luckier than others. Judy Mack was driving on the top level of Highway 880 when it collapsed.
Did you think you were going to survive?
First I thought I was going to die because where it hurts a lot.
Where did it hurt?
The whole stomach in my heart.
She had trauma much more typical of an earthquake, crushing injuries to her internal organs. While hospitals around the Bay Area treated hundreds of injured, they also saw another common condition, patients suffering from anxiety and fear.
One lady particularly was an older woman who I'd taken care of in the past, and she was just hysterical and required IV Valium to calm her down so that we could take care of her.
Ivy Tatum, like many of those admitted to hospital last night, has heart disease and suffered the onset of chest pain when the quake hit.
Look like my heart is going to stop beating me.
But her doctor wasn't that sure.
I, not being from the area, I had no idea when it was going to stop. I was really afraid. As we ran for the hallway, the walls were moving, I think, 6 or 8 inches, and the floor was jerking below us, and I was really looking at the walls, expecting them to start to crack.
While many people are happy to be alive and can almost joke about it like this, Doctor, in the long run, I guess, there are going to be long, sort of psychological scars, deep psychological scars, and I think they're going to come from 2 different things. One, chronic anxiety for those who had a close brush with death or thought that they had, and secondly, those who may become chronically depressed or even commit suicide because they have lost close friends and relatives.
Let us hope that turns out to be not very many, if any, people. Dr. Bob Arnott, thank you very much.
Thank you, Dan.
What's going on around us here? You hear this noise, you see dust swirl up from time to time. The central thing that's going on is the rescue workers simply will not give up until they take a look at every automobile squashed beneath that Highway 880 back there. Also, from time to time, there are calls from help from other people, that the police and other law enforcement and civil defense people are getting telephone calls. People say, I need help. So that all of that's part of what's happening around us, in addition to losing our power. Speaking of power, let's go to Washington, D.C. for the perspective there. You can say, well, listen, the earthquakes in Northern California, but keep in mind that any time you have a disaster, particularly a natural disaster such as Hurricane Hugo or this earthquake, never mind an unnatural one like the oil spill in Alaska, Washington swirls with controversy whether it's justified or unjustified, fair or unfair. And our CBS News White House correspondent Leslie Stahl has been covering the round and round they go. Where does it stop? Nobody knows this time. Leslie?
Well, Dan, as you say, fair or unfair, President Bush has been harshly criticized for not responding quickly enough in past disasters, as you mentioned, the Exxon Valdez oil spill, Hurricane Hugo, but he has seized on this one. He activated the government's relief mechanism within 1 hour of the earthquake last night. Today, he moved quickly to sign a disaster relief declaration, and he has decided he'll visit the area on Friday.
We're working with state and local officials to ensure that the relief effort is coordinated and effective as possible.
Government concern was on display. In a giant news conference, 7 different agencies explained their roles. The Pentagon said 10,000 National Guardsmen are already on duty. The Justice Department was there to say it wasn't doing anything yet, but it's ready.
How about downtown San Francisco with those big towers and all of that?
The president went on a tour of FEMA, the agency coordinating the federal relief effort. $273 million left in the Hurricane Hugo cleanup fund is being diverted to California for emergency assistance. But the administration acknowledges much more money is needed.
This is not a 1-punch. It's not a 2-punch. This is not a 3-punch. This is not a 4-punch. This is 4 catastrophic disaster events, any one of which, with the possible exception in North Carolina, exceeds the total size of a total year's multiple disasters.
But federal funding to minimize the damage caused by earthquakes has been slashed 40% over the last 10 years, and President Bush has asked for another 5% cut this year.
Despite today's flurry of activities in Washington, FEMA admitted that it doesn't yet have its field offices set up in San Francisco. They don't even have their federal hotline up to answer questions about disaster aid. There is so much bureaucratic red tape. They can't get their hotline up until they first set up a string of field offices all around the Bay Area, and they haven't even located buildings for those yet. It'll be next week at the earliest. Dan?
Leslie Stahl, thanks. We've talked about this being a live broadcast, and we talked about trying to bring you up to date on what is happening. What we're about to say is not pleasant, but if you were here, and we think one of the things that television does well is take you there, bring you to a place such as this. What, in addition to what you'd be seeing and hearing, you would now be actually smelling death. What's happened is on the Highway 880 back there, they're lifting some of the concrete. They've lifted some by U.S. Navy giant helicopters. They're beginning to lift some of the concrete off the automobiles. And the unmistakable whiff of death is over this. So the time you say, well, it wasn't such a big earthquake, it's worth reminding oneself that at least some 270 people died, 250 of them right back there. Last night, the routine drive across the San Francisco Bay Bridge turned into a nightmare for those caught on it when the quake struck. So this is the place where you saw that home video a little earlier in the broadcast. Joining me now, live here from Oakland, California, is Chris Mitchell, who was lucky enough to walk away from the San Francisco Bay Bridge and the earthquake last night. Chris, what was it like? Tell me what you saw and heard and felt.
Well, Dan, I walked away from the Cypress structure over here. My car was, it felt like it had a flat tire, so I slowed down. Immediately, the upper deck, I was on the lower deck, fell upon me.
I want to make sure I understand, Chris, and because things have been so chaotic here, you were actually on this
I was about a block from here.
Superhighway.
I was on that thing between
and not on the Bay Bridge.
No, sir. I was between those 2 slabs right there. And it fell on my car. There was enough support by other cars holding it up and enough support by the cross members that I was in a little hole where it didn't smash the car. And I was alive. I immediately kicked out my back window, climbed out, and climbed down one of these pillars over here on the other side as quick as I possibly could because there was gas fumes and body parts all over the place, and there was nobody alive to come with me.
Chris, when the earthquake was underway, what did it feel like?
didn't know there was an earthquake for about 20 minutes. All I knew was a freeway fell on me. At that time, it was nothing but confusion. I immediately climbed down and sat down on the ground far from any structures. And somebody later told me it was an earthquake. All I knew is there was a freeway on that hit me in the head.
What did it sound like?
Silence. There was silence. Nobody, there was nothing. There was silence when I got out of my car. Quiet, and it was quite graphic, though. But there was no sound.
Quite graphic meaning?
There was blood all over the road. As I got out of my car, in front of me there was the brain of a person quivering on the ground by itself. You asked.
Well, this is not a movie. This is reality. This is covering an earthquake.
I've never seen a movie like that. Never. I'm still shaken. It's a day later.
Our CBS News live coverage of the aftermath of the great earthquake of '89 will continue in a few moments.
And then the third floor just slid down onto North Point Street here and just opened up my roof.
There's a new report on the California earthquake continues. From Oakland, here is Dan Rabbit.
Earthquakes are as old as the Earth itself. CBS News correspondent Mark Phillips reports on why they happen.
Always poses questions about how it happens and whether anything can be done about it. Seismologists today were able to provide some, but not all, of the answers.
On the surface, an earthquake is an example of the massive, uncontrollable, indifferent force of nature. Beneath the surface, even more irresistible forces are at work.
And it's inevitable that these earthquakes occur.
Inevitable because the Earth's crust, terra firma, is really not very firm at all. It's composed of continent and ocean-sized plates about 10 miles thick, floating on a core of molten rock, constantly in motion. The North American plate moving southward, the Pacific plate moving generally northward. Where they meet and rub together, there's trouble. That trouble is called the San Andreas Fault.
The 35-mile-long length of the San Andreas Fault broke. That is, one side of the fault moved past the other several feet.
This is a section of the San Andreas Fault that last had earthquakes in 1865 and 1890 of this size.
Normally, the plates creep against each other at a speed of about 2 inches a year, about as fast as your fingernail grows. Sometimes they move along quietly, sometimes not.
As the plates of the Earth move relative to each other, such as this eraser, they build up energy, and all of a sudden the energy is released when there's a movement.
Seismologists looking at computer-generated maps of this quake and its aftershocks can explain how and why earthquakes occur, but not when. They do know that, however destructive this quake was, it was not the big one.
This definitely was not the big one. This was only a magnitude 7 earthquake. A magnitude 8 earthquake has roughly 30 times the energy that a magnitude 7 has.
The Great San Francisco quake of 1906 is estimated at about 8.3 on the Richter scale, and the fault directly under the city hasn't budged since then. This last quake has not lessened the chances of a major earthquake for San Francisco. It has only given Bay Area residents a taste of what will surely come. Dan?
Mark Phillips in Washington, thanks. Joining me now are two experts on earthquakes from the U.S. Geological Survey, Dr. Robert Wesson in Washington, D.C., and with me, who's waited so patiently, Dr. Robert Wallace, here live from Oakland, California. Dr. Wallace, first to you, what, in your opinion and from your standpoint, are the most important things for us to know about this earthquake and the future?
I think we should reaffirm that there will be another big earthquake like 1906, but it may be 100 years off. In 1988, the U.S. Geological Survey convened a panel of experts who estimated that the 1906 type of earthquake, that size, there are about 300 years on the average between them. So we may have a long time before that, thank goodness. However, we have some other little more disconcerting thoughts in that before the 1906 earthquake, for many decades, there were these 6s and 7s and magnitude 5s. And then it all shut off until about 1957. Now we've seen several decades of dozens of these 5, 6, and now a 7. before 1906. However, on the odds, we have to bet on more 6s and 7s than the 8, and that's what we should be planning for.
Dr. Robert Wesson in Washington, from your viewpoint, what are the most important things for us to know in the wake of this very large earthquake?
Dan, the most important thing for us to know is to understand the power that these earthquakes have and the potential for devastation that they can bring to our communities. One of the points that Dr. Wallace made is that we should anticipate more of these magnitude 6s and 7s before we have another 8. One of the real problems that we could face would be a magnitude 6 or 7 closer to one of our major metropolitan areas. That is, right in the Oakland, Hayward, Fremont area, for example, along the Hayward Fault. Having that earthquake closer to the area of development could cause much more serious damage even than we saw in the earthquake yesterday.
Dr. Wesson, I recall from covering the not so long ago earthquake in Mexico City that it was followed, my recollection is, by some very large earthquakes, not as large as the original one, very quickly. Is that likely to happen now in this situation? We've, after all, gone more than 24 hours since the main shock here.
Dan, we still have the potential for large aftershocks from this earthquake. Typically, from an earthquake of this size, we have thousands of aftershocks. As of about noon today, there are 1,400 aftershocks have been located by the Geological Survey in Menlo Park. Most of those aftershocks have been very small, perhaps not even felt, even in the immediate area. The larger ones have been felt, but we still should expect the possibility of earthquakes perhaps as large as magnitude 6 that could cause significant damage, particularly to structures that were damaged in the original main shock.
Dr. Robert Wallace, I've heard two things today I want to ask you about since you're the expert. One, is a growing body of thought, by no means a majority, that this particular earthquake may not have actually occurred in the Andreas Fault. Do you think that's true? Or
No, absolutely not. It's very clear. These aftershocks that Dr. Weston spoke of, 1,000 or more, we were getting something one every 3 minutes. They have literally painted in the area of disturbance along about a 30-mile segment of the San Andreas Fault, south of Highway 17, south of Los Gatos, for about 25, 30. It's just, I mean, it's very clear that that's where it was.
No doubt it was in the Andreas Fault.
No doubt that it was San Andreas Fault.
Did the main force of the shock waves go south or north, or do we know yet?
Well, it radiates out more or less evenly. I think there is a point where we stand here now and seeing these structures toppled. There is a tendency for the very rapid vibrations, such as that, to die away. We're 50 miles or more away from the epicenter, and it leaves only these, only this very slow swaying, which gets in rhythm with these structures and causes the toppling.
Thank you very much. Our CBS News live coverage of the California earthquake from Oakland, California will continue in a moment, so stay here with us.
I doubt that I'll live in San Francisco anymore. I'm a native Californian, too, and I never was afraid of earthquakes, but
This is just too much.
too much watching the sidewalk open up.
Beyond San Francisco Bay and beyond Oakland, from where we're doing this broadcast, the rescue workers go into their second night of looking for victims and hoping they'll find some still alive on this Oakland Highway 880, where more than 250 people already are known to have died. Jerry Bowen has been shoulder to shoulder with the rescue workers for more than 24 hours now. Jerry, what's the scene down there actually at the structure at the moment?
Dan, we've just been given some new information on the recovery effort. It is not good. They have just removed several more bodies within the past hour, we are told. They have seen 50 other bodies in the rubble. Several hours ago, they airlifted a remote-controlled tractor, which is going to begin cutting through the cement to locate the cars, and then those will be lifted by crane down to the ground below. The number of survivors that came from this disaster, now number 50. It is said by the acting city manager of Oakland that it will be no small miracle if more survivors are found tonight. The workers here are going on a 24-hour schedule They are not giving up, but the reality may be there is very little hope.
Jerry, thanks. Joining me now is Richard Eisner of the Bay Area Earthquake Preparedness Project. Mr. Eisner, thank you for taking time to join us tonight. I know how busy you are. So how well prepared were you?
I think we were extremely well prepared for this earthquake. The citizenry knew what to do to protect themselves. They responded appropriately afterwards. They did the things we've been training them to do. I think we did very well on the citizen preparedness part, the government preparedness part. The local governments responded well. The problem is we have a lot of hazardous structures out there, like the building, the structure behind us, that we know are going to collapse. And unless we start dealing with the hazardous structures, we're not going to solve the earthquake problem.
So why build them? If you know they're going to collapse. I mean, this question keeps coming up after every earthquake. Why build these stuff?
Most of these buildings were built some time ago. This was built in 1950, and the older brick buildings we've seen collapse, and the older wooden structures were built in the 30s and 40s. The newer structures, I think, perform quite well. We've seen very little damage in new buildings. The only problem is we have a huge inventory of these old buildings that we're trying to strengthen. It's costly, it's very political, and there are very large social and economic costs that we have to bear.
Thank you very much for being with us. We want to mention, as we come to the end of this CBS News special report live from California on the earthquake tonight, that tomorrow night, 48 hours on these CBS stations, 48 hours at 8 tomorrow night, 7 Central Time, we'll come back to the California earthquake. We'll have fresh material and the latest information for you. In closing, I want to go back to the sunrise of this morning. Some of us went up in a CBS helicopter as soon as dawn came today. And yes, there was real death, real injury, real destruction, real debris everywhere. But there were an awful lot of real people working awfully hard. Mr. Eisner just mentioned it. Senator Wilson mentioned it earlier. To make sure they help their neighbor. A lot of one-on-one helping. The leadership, community was very good. People took the lead. A lot of people in this neighborhood pitched in and are still pitching in to help back here in this rescue effort. It's that sort of thing that has one thinking, well, it's a tremendous tragedy, but it's also a great moment in the history of Northern California. Because when you have people pulling together that way, they'll be back. They'll be all the way back. For CBS News, Dan Rather. Good night.
Idea.
Briefly to collect their belongings. But for those with no place else to go, a 15-minute scramble for possessions was little comfort.
I don't find that anybody in this particular area is helpful. They throw the stuff out and they leave you here by yourself in the dark. How am I supposed to...
Officials say even residents whose homes survived the quake face weeks or even months before full utility service can be restored. South of the Bay Area in towns near the center of the quake, the task of digging out is far from over as well. And like everywhere else, survivors there are struggling to come to terms with what's been lost. Bob McNamara reports.
It was a slow race against time. Rescuers, brick by brick, unearthing the rubble of a Santa Cruz building collapse. 23-year-old Robin Ortiz, a gourmet coffee store employee trapped inside, and friends hoping against hope she was alive.
She's one of the strongest people that I know, and if anybody would live through something like this, she would.
But Canadian rescue experts brought here after the quake doubted Ortiz could have survived.
If one of my family were in there, I'd be upset. I'd be wanting to go in there, but sooner or later, reality has to set in, too.
It was the pace of the rescue effort that wore down the patience of Robin Ortiz's friends.
That's right. If you guys spend half as much time trying to get this girl out as you do arresting people for sleeping out in the bushes and arresting people for eating food at the park, you'd have had her out a long time ago.
But then, almost 48 hours after the quake, work stopped. A victim was found.
It is the body of 22-year-old Robin Ortiz.
For 2 days, Robin Ortiz's friends had staged a vigil for a miraculous rescue, but no miracle was made. Bob McNamara, CBS News, Santa Cruz.
President Bush is flying to California this morning for a first-hand look at the disaster area. Mr. Bush left Andrews Air Force Base outside Washington just before dawn this morning. He plans to see devastated areas of Santa Cruz and Interstate 880 in Oakland. The trip comes as some members of Congress are criticizing the federal relief effort as too slow. Well, I realize it's only October, but Mother Nature doesn't. Much of the
chip away at hundreds of tons of concrete and steel that now lay over the bottom deck of Interstate 880. Let us show you now a videotape that was shot by CBS News just a few minutes ago. Yet another body being lifted from a hole that had been dug into the freeway, the body contained in a body bag. Despite the fact that bodies are continually being found, there is some cause for hope here this morning. Officials are now saying there may be many fewer deaths than originally feared.
Rescue workers digging through tons of concrete are finding vehicles spaced far apart instead of the bumper-to-bumper traffic they expected. The freeway collapsed during rush hour, leading officials to predict as many as 200 died. Now they are sure the number will be less, although no new estimate is being made. Work to reach the vehicles continues around the clock.
You always have the hope that you're going to find somebody alive, and that's what keeps rescue workers going. As time goes by, the probability decreases with every hour that passes.
Bodies found are marked for recovery.
But I don't think there's anybody that hasn't at least shed a quiet tear over what's going on here, and that's increased their resolve to come down here and do all that they can.
It may be quite some time before we know what the actual death count is. One construction engineer says this morning it could be 3 months before all of the concrete and steel is removed from the freeway. Harry?
Scott Tolley reporting with us here in Oakland this morning. Thanks very much. We want to go back across to the other side of the bay this morning and check in with correspondent David Dow. Good morning, David.
Good morning, Harry. In hotels not far from here, visitors are waking up to welcome news. Electricity and hot water are back. And so, too, is the look of normalcy over much of this city. But for residents of San Francisco's hard-hit Marina District, the nightmare goes on.
What I'm telling you is, nobody's house is going to be taken down unless they know about it. So take it easy.
It isn't easy to take it easy when you know your home faces demolition. Yesterday, hundreds were allowed back to their homes to claim what they could during a 15-minute final visit. Even those with homes that survived don't have it easy. There's no electricity and no prospect of gas service.
And it's going to be long weeks before we're able to rebuild and get the marina back on our gas service.
As it turns out, many security cameras in San Francisco captured the moment of Tuesday's earthquake, the city's worst since 1906. This was shot in an appliance store that was shaken but escaped major damage. Authorities now estimate damages in San Francisco at $2 billion. But the earthquake served to remind some of a potential long-range cost that could be even higher. The cost of replacing older, substandard buildings.
We have several hundred buildings in this city which, in a little bit stronger ground motion, will collapse.
Today, the cable cars are back in San Francisco, one more cheerful sign of normalcy returning. But normalcy may bring new problems to many of 170,000 daily commuters seek alternate routes to San Francisco's Bay Bridge. The bridge, of course, was damaged in Tuesday's earthquake and may take weeks or months to be repaired.
There is no sign of government relief. The victims are subsisting on corn, the main crop of the region, and a few vegetables from the last harvest. The earthquake struck such a wide area, hundreds of square miles in 2 provinces, that it is impossible to calculate total damages or casualties. According to official sources, more than 10,000 homes were destroyed. The land is poor and the people poorer. At the moment, the victims seem to be in shock, unable to start rebuilding, but knowing that the frigid winter is almost here and that somehow they will have to endure. John Sheehan, CBS News, Beijing.
In this country, cold kind of taking its toll on all of us, but what did you find when you went out in the last 24 hours?
Well, Harry, if a bridge that's so far away from the epicenter that's like behind us is so damaged, you can imagine what the area very close to the epicenter looks like. Well, yesterday we went with one of the insurance catastrophe teams, or CAT teams for short, to see one of those communities.
People moved to the Santa Cruz Mountains to find peace and tranquility. But it wasn't so peaceful here Tuesday night.
The earth shook, and it seemed like it wasn't going to stop.
When it did stop, only part of Linda Moulton's century-old house survived.
It really struck me that this part of the house is not anymore, not to be.
Just up the road, Linda and Roger Wollenson came home to shambles, the stone fireplace in a pile. The house pushed a foot off the foundation, and only yards from their home, the culprit left its signature.
Unbelievable. It's unbelievable.
The Wollensons are among the few in this area who are insured against earthquake damage. But although their agent offered to pay for a hotel room, they turned him down.
There's something comforting in staying. You can't control much, but at least I can mop my kitchen and get the syrup off the floor.
It's the same reason the Summit grocery store is open for business. Although there's not much left intact on store shelves to sell. There are an estimated 8,000 residents still without water or electricity, but there have been remarkably few injuries. Bill Roster was on his way to his workshop when it collapsed in a heap.
I was about 5 minutes from being inside of it. Unbelievable.
Like most of his neighbors, Roster is already making plans to rebuild. And 48 hours after the quake, the mountain tranquility is almost restored. Although for many, things will never be quite the same.
In some ways, this is even worse than any kind of hurricane, because when a hurricane comes in, it's over and people can start cleaning up. But in this case, the aftershocks continue. These people have no idea how much damage they're going to have. The damage continues.
Aaron Moriarty, thanks so much. We appreciate it. Get some rest, get your voice back. And we should add to that, the damage is so widespread in that part of the Bay Area. There may be as many, some I heard as I came in this morning, as many as 10,000 homeless. Kathleen?
Harry, Aaron. And still ahead this morning, we're going to check in on the spring fashion shows in Paris, talk to Pat George.
The live picture. We've got people up on top of 880 now this morning. They've got the bottom part shored up enough that they feel confident that they can work up there. They even have some heavy equipment up there, but the round-the-clock recovery process continues, and the somewhat good news this morning is the estimated number of people killed in this highway structure collapse is less than it was yesterday, but we'll just have to wait and see as that process continues. Aaron Moriarty just back from Santa Cruz and Los Gatos. Give me some of your impressions visually as you travel around there.
Well, one thing, just getting there was difficult, and I had no idea. We went up, we were up in a mountain area. The whole road moved over, you know, a foot, 2 feet, and huge cracks in the road. And so that was one of the problems for rescue workers and insurance people to come up and even find out what kind of damage is up there. And then just, in a way, a lot of people were very lucky because we saw homes totally collapse, and yet there were very few injuries up there.
One of the things that happens as a result of that, I mean, the homes being smaller, maybe even less well constructed, is there's less debris that comes down on folks, and it's easier to get out of versus if you're in a much bigger building, for instance.
And they're also wood construction. In many of the homes, in fact, wood construction is actually preferred for an earthquake area, and that's what helped some of the people. At least there were some structures and they could get out even though the walls were falling down around them.
I want to show you some pictures now of a very eerie experience we had last night. Through the help of some state officials, we got onto the Oakland-San Francisco Bay Bridge, San Francisco-Oakland Bay Bridge, whatever you want to call it. This is a structure that was built more than 50 years ago, and this was really an engineering marvel. Of course, that is the span right there of the top section of the highway that literally just collapsed. And as we got out of our vehicles there last night, this entire bridge is completely closed. There's no one up there. There's not even any real power, any lights on there at all. And as we walked out, as we got out of our vehicles, it was almost like we had sea legs. It was so eerie and so it was absolutely frightening.
If you ask me.
Yeah, and you know, you get the almost like sea legs as we approach the edge there where the roadway had completely collapsed.
And they consider both those ends safe enough to have workers on there?
Yeah. What's interesting about it, though, is as they try and get those pieces to a point where they can extract them or start putting it back together again, very, very delicate procedure, because they say one wrong move, if something really gets loose and comes back and bangs back against the superstructure of the bridge, it could do really considerable damage. We should also say at this point that the original estimations were maybe a couple of weeks to get that bridge back in action again. That is being doubted a lot, maybe a couple of months minimum. On the other end of it, people in this part of the country are really reevaluating how they travel. As many as 250,000 people use that bridge every day.
And it's a lot longer distance.
We'll be back. Sort of good news this morning from the Bay Area. They're revising now the estimated number of dead, the number of victims in the collapse of Highway 880, the so-called Cypress structure. We'll have more on that a little bit later on this morning, and we'll also have more of the story of the earthquake 2.5 days after in the recovery process here in the San Francisco Bay Area. Kathleen?
Also in this half hour, what might be the ultimate contest between a human being and a computer. The world chess champion, Garry Kasparov, is going to be here, and we're going to match wits with an electronic opponent named Deep Thought. The first time it's ever been done. And Pat George is going to be joining us live in this half hour from Paris on how the Japanese influence are a bit threatening the French fashion capital. Now the news. Here's Faith Daniels. Faith.
Kathleen, as Harry indicated, than half the original estimate. Crews working around the clock on what's left of I-880 are finding fewer cars than expected. The quake hit during evening rush hour when the traffic on the freeway was normally bumper to bumper. But earlier on CBS this morning, the county sheriff told Harry apparently that was not the case on Tuesday.
It's very difficult to get an accurate figure, but they've been probing around, and we think maybe we have about 75 cars in there. I don't know if there's any more than that or not. We have the coroner responsibility also, and what my major concern right now is the removal process, and it's speeded up.
They're thinking that many people hurried home early to watch the World Series. Sheriff Plummer says he hopes that the final toll will be less than 100. As for the damaged Bay Bridge, officials say the problems there are worse than originally thought. It could be 2 months before the bridge can reopen.